The term existentialism was coined about 30 years ago, initially mainly to refer to a couple of German philosophers about whom I shall talk hardly at all in the series of 3 lectures, namely Karl Jaspers and Martin Heidegger. It was, however, only after World War II that through the writings of the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, existentialism became very well known and very much talked about all over the world, and quite especially in the United States too. Although there is a good deal of interest in it and it's very much discussed, there's no complete agreement about just what existentialism means, about just what it refers to. It might be foolish for me to say, here is what exactly it means, but it is surely essential for me, if I want to give 3 lectures about it, to tell you how I am going to use the term. I'm going to use it as a label to refer to a number of people who are usually meant by the term, and these would be quite particularly Søren Kierkegaard and Heidegger and Jaspers and Jean-Paul Sartre. I'll say something about Nietzsche in a few minutes, seeing that the second lecture will be largely devoted to Nietzsche. Now, why use the term existentialism as such a label instead of using the word, rather giving a clear-cut definition of it? There's one existentialist who tried to give a definition of it. Sartre said that existentialism was the doctrine that teaches that existence precedes essence. There are a number of things that are bad about this definition. The first one is, and this in itself isn't crucial, that it's terribly unclear, that it's even harder to understand what it means that existence precedes essence than it's to understand, quite apart from that, what existentialism might be. The second reason for not accepting this definition, which after all perhaps could be explained, is that no sooner had Sartre said that in a lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism, then Heidegger published a letter on humanism in which he said, if that's existentialism, I'm not an existentialist. And along came Jaspers and said, count me out too. And if we look back, for example, to Kierkegaard, for example, to Nietzsche, or if we take a sidelong glance at Camus, it seems clear that these other men would not accept this particular definition either. Now one might see, is there some other definition that we can impose on the lot of them? And it doesn't seem to me to be a particularly fruitful undertaking. We might perhaps later in this course of lectures look back afterwards and see whether some one definition comes to mind. Meanwhile, I don't have a bad conscience at all about just using it as such a label. There are any number of other labels that we use in a similar way. For example, when we speak of American pragmatism, what are we doing but simply using some sort of shorthand device to refer all at once to Peirce and James and Dewey, perhaps also to Mead, perhaps also to one or another person who comes to mind. But we don't work with any very clear-cut definition, and if we happen to be close students of any 2 of these men, say of James and Dewey or of James and Peirce, then the more we read them, the more we become aware of the fact that they really don't agree with each other at all, that there are very important points on which they disagree with each other. And still it's useful sometimes to discuss them together because there are some family resemblances between them. There are certain ways in which they belong recognizably together rather than belong with other groups. Similarly, when we speak of continental rationalists, as we sometimes do in philosophy courses, then we mean Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz, and as we study them, we find that they violently disagreed with each other on points that mattered deeply to them. I'll just give one more such example, namely British empiricism. Another such label, it refers to Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, and if we examine them closely, we find, for example, that Locke was a deist, that Berkeley was a bishop, and that Hume was, to be polite about it, an agnostic. So there were certainly very many things about which these three disagreed with each other, and they criticized each other, and still there are some things that Locke, Berkeley, and Hume sort of seem to have in common, even if it's a little difficult to say what precisely it is, and that distinguishes them from the rationalists or from the pragmatists. So there's nothing unusual about using the term existentialism as a label for a group of people, and then sort of as an afterthought asking ourselves, now what are the traits that they have in common? Now the traits that they have in common are, first of all, that the men that we usually call existentialists are all of them very radical individualists. And this is what makes it so hard to pin them all down to a common platform. They're all men who have very much a mind of their own and to make a point of going it alone. In fact, part of whose common outlook is that there is something wrong with schools of philosophy, that there is something wrong with drafting some kind of a platform, that there is something wrong with philosophic systems. They are people who, in a phrase that Nietzsche once used in Zarathustra, like only what a man has written with his blood. In other words, stuff that doesn't come from the brain alone, but rather stuff in which a man is engaged as an entire personality with all his experience. This is the sort of thing they're like. And if a man tries to transpose into prose all of his experience, then seeing that his experience and his character is bound to be different from somebody else's, there will be a distinctive individual quality to his writing which distinguishes him from the other men. And so, as we take up in these three lectures three different men, we will find that everyone has very much a style of his own and a character of his own and a mode of thinking of his own. Positively, we can say that one further thing that they have in common is a concern with extreme situations, extreme experiences, the most intense experiences, the most extraordinary experiences, and in the narrower sense, we might say the less happy experiences. When I say in a narrower sense, this leaves out to some extent Nietzsche, who is certainly a borderline figure, a very doubtful candidate for existentialism. What he has in common with the other existentialists is that he too is particularly interested in ultimate experiences, but unlike most of the other existentialists, he does not emphasize so exclusively, to cite the titles of some of Kierkegaard's books, fear and trembling, and the sickness unto death which is despair, and the concept of dread, and going beyond Kierkegaard now, the experience of the anticipation in thought of one's own death. On the whole, the existentialists are particularly preoccupied with the gloomier experiences, but at any rate with the most dramatic, with the most tragic experiences. This, of course, in large measure accounts for the intelligent person's interest in existentialism and accounts for the fact that even people who find most current philosophy not particularly interesting feel that when it comes to existentialism, there is something here that's of concern to them, because existentialists do talk about experiences about which it is difficult to be indifferent. Experiences that matter to all of us and that engage our interest if they are written about with any sensitivity and intelligence at all. What is implicit in what I have said so far is that if the question is raised, for example, was Pascal an existentialist, or was Albert Camus an existentialist, there is no right or wrong answer here. All we can say is, well, there are certain things that these men have in common with people usually called existentialists, and then we can see are there also some things that distinguish them from the other existentialists. In what respects are they like other members of the family? In what respects are they different? Certainly we must not make up our minds on the basis of whether they like each other. It so happens that most of the living existentialists dislike each other quite intensely, but that happens in some families too, and that's no proof that somebody doesn't belong to the family. On the contrary, precisely people who have much in common with each other and who have inherited some of the same traits sometimes find each other particularly trying. And that applies to existentialists too. A further implication of what I have said is that it would not be proper to say that existentialism is a synonym for modern philosophy. There are some modern philosophers, especially French and German ones, though not only French and German ones, who are existentialists, but there are also many other modern philosophers, including most modern English-speaking philosophers, who are not existentialists. The existentialists are those who share these traits that I have talked about, who are so individualistic, who are impatient with things that are remote from life, who deal with dramatic experiences. Now, how shall we relate existentialism to what I have called the modern crisis? That there are all sorts of crises in our time is surely not controversial. Unquestionably, our time is a time of crisis. But I do not mean to imply right from the start, without having examined the matter at all, that our time is uniquely a time of crisis. About this, I would like temporarily to suspend judgment. So if one or the other of you should feel that perhaps every time is a time of crisis, or at least that there have been many other times that have been just as critical as our time, we needn't argue about this at all. We needn't have any difference about this at all. All that I want to say is that there are some crises in our time, and what I want to do is to relate existentialism to three such crises in our time: the one in religion today, the one in philosophy next week, the one in morality 2 weeks from today, and then we can see each time to what extent each of these three crises is uniquely modern, or to what extent it is perhaps a perpetual crisis. Now, why do I pick out the three men that I have picked out? Kierkegaard for today, Nietzsche for next week, and Sartre for 2 weeks from tonight. First of all, there are strong reasons for beginning with Kierkegaard, because he is the first unquestionable existentialist. He is the one who started the whole modern movement of existentialism, even though now in retrospect we can look further back and find existentialist features in the thought of Pascal or even St. Augustine, or as some people would like to do, all the way back in the book of Job. Still, as a philosophic and literary movement, existentialism starts with Kierkegaard. Moreover, Kierkegaard is undoubtedly one of the most commanding and impressive figures of existentialism, and I think of the religious existentialists, probably the most remarkable. So he is, to my mind, a particularly good and I would say obvious choice for discussing religious existentialism. The international renown of existentialism is largely due to Jean-Paul Sartre, and I would say that if we look at literary representatives of existentialism, Sartre is probably the outstanding one, the one who in brilliant novels, short stories, plays, and essays, as well as philosophic treatises, has brought existentialism to our attention. And here too, in the case of Sartre, just as in the case of Kierkegaard, I am influenced by my considerable respect for the man. Nietzsche was not, as I have already remarked, strictly speaking, in the narrow sense of the word, an existentialist, but I think a good case can be made out for saying that he towers very far indeed above such philosophers as Jaspers and Heidegger, perhaps even to the extent of being the last world historical philosopher. By which I mean that since Nietzsche's time, philosophers have not had a really international impact. A man like Sartre, a man like Jaspers, a man like Heidegger has had very little impact on English-speaking philosophy. On the other hand, the giants of English-speaking philosophy, people like Russell and Moore and John Dewey and William James, have had hardly any impact in the non-English-speaking world on continental European thought. Nietzsche is, I think, the last great philosopher in whom we find impulses and tendencies that have been influential and crucially important for philosophy almost everywhere. So I pick him too because he seems to me to be of unusual stature. To wind up then these introductory remarks, I would say that I happen to be, as some of you know, critical of existentialism, but the point of this series of 3 lectures will not be to tear down existentialism. It will not be to try to show how foolish it all is, and that is why I have picked 3 men to whom in various ways, although I am critical of them here or there, I do look up. And what I want to do is to try to increase your understanding as best I can, not only of these 3 men, but also of existentialism, and beyond that, of some aspects of the modern world, of 3 crises in particular, of issues that concern all of us, and perhaps here and there I may be able to make some constructive suggestions. Now let us begin with Kierkegaard. I propose to approach him somewhat differently from the way he is usually approached. I think he himself would have said that the usual approach to his thought is, in his own peculiar use of that word, aesthetic. When Kierkegaard speaks of an aesthetic approach, an aesthetic orientation, what he means is that one is a spectator, that one looks at something that is outside oneself, that one observes without becoming involved in it. An extreme form of an aesthetic attitude would be if you collapse in front of your TV set and just try to be entertained. But that would not be the only example of an aesthetic attitude. The attitude would remain aesthetic, the way Kierkegaard uses the term, as long as you make no commitment, as long as you yourself do not become deeply involved. And I dare say that most current interpretations of and most current interest in Kierkegaard is of this aesthetic nature, that he is a terribly interesting person. Being interesting would be, in Kierkegaard's peculiar use of the term, an aesthetic category. It's interesting, it's fascinating, just look at it. Secondly, people usually look at Kierkegaard by way of pointing out that he was very critical of the German philosopher Hegel. And since there's hardly anybody who is not very critical of Hegel, if he talks about Hegel at all, This too is not very distinctive. To say he is interesting, to say he hates Hegel's guts, this really doesn't set him apart. Almost everybody does. Thirdly, people usually present Kierkegaard as if he had been something of an apologist, either an apologist for Christianity or preferably a sort of non-denominational apologist for religion, somebody who sort of fits into the current scene as one of the many people who are, of course, as who is not, in favor of religion. In all three respects, my approach to Kierkegaard is very different. First of all, it's not aesthetic, but existential. Instead of just saying, now, isn't he a beautiful writer? Doesn't he put things quaintly? Isn't this a nice book? I will say, isn't this a maddening book? Isn't this something that is meant to upset us? Kierkegaard uses deliberately the word that is found in the epistles of Paul, skandalon, a scandal, a stumbling block, an outrage, something that is upsetting. Kierkegaard wants to upset us, and I will try to emphasize elements in his thought that are upsetting. This takes me to the second point. Instead of claiming that he criticized Hegel, which he certainly did, I will say that he criticized Hegel and Hegelianism because philosophers in his time, for the most part, were Hegelians, but that he really criticized philosophy quite generally, and that if he had lived in our time, instead of picking on poor old Hegel, I'm sure he would have picked on pragmatism, or he would have picked on logical positivism or analytic philosophy, any kind of philosophy, indeed beyond philosophy. He would have criticized our trust in reason, our trust in science. This is something that is, to the modern mind, somewhat outrageous, but this is something that has to be brought out. And finally, very far from being an apologist for Christianity or for religion, somebody who tries to make it palatable, Kierkegaard wore himself out in trying to denounce people who sought to make religion and Christianity in particular palatable, and insisted that it is not palatable, but that it is absolutely absurd, that it's outrageous to the human reason, that it might even outrage our moral sense, and that nevertheless it should be accepted. In other words, his conception of religion, once it is understood, I think, is seen not to fit at all into the current revival of religion, but on the contrary, Kierkegaard, if he were living today, I'm sure would be a particularly outspoken and radical critic of the kind of religion that is flourishing today. And this wants to be brought out if one wants to do justice to the man who said of himself in what is perhaps one of the nicest passages of his writings, that when he was about 30, one day he sat in the park and he said to himself, here I'm 30 years old, and what have I done? Very, very little. Here are so many great men in our time, and they all have done so much, and I have done so little. And then he thought about it, and he decided that what all these men were doing to the best of their ability was to make life easier, and that he himself had no talent for making life easier, and so he resolved to make things more difficult. I think that's a lovely passage in the concluding unscientific postscript, how Kierkegaard resolves to make things more difficult. And one doesn't do justice to him and his heritage if one talks about him for an hour in a lecture, if one doesn't bring out this crucial element that here's somebody who related himself to Socrates because he too wanted to be a gadfly. He too wanted to make things difficult. Now let me very quickly fill in some data about his life. He was born in 1813 and he died in 1855, and he lived almost all his life in Denmark, specifically in Copenhagen, though he briefly studied also at the University of Berlin. His father was a very strict and rigid authoritarian a very pious man who was bothered by the fact that once, when he had been very poor as a young boy, he had out on the heather cursed God. And this bothered not only the father, but it also bothered the son very deeply. Kierkegaard also remembers how his father wouldn't allow him much to go outdoors, but said there's no need to go outdoors. Perhaps this had something to do with the fact that the boy, Søren Kierkegaard, was somewhat crippled, somewhat misshapen. Perhaps that was why the father didn't want him to go out too much. The father said, we can take a walk in this room. We can just walk up and down together. And as they walked up and down together for perhaps half an hour at a time, the father described what they saw. Castles in Spain, and he described them in such great detail, everything that they saw, and with such painstaking and vivid imagination that after about half an hour the boy was all worn out from so much experience and as exhausted as if he had been playing ball for hours. This greatly stimulated his imagination, but also made him something very peculiar, somewhat solipsistic, somebody who could sort of after a while just stay by himself and imagine all sorts of things without ever actually coming into contact with other people. Then one day it seemed to the young boy that there was strong evidence that his father had seduced his mother before they were married, when the father's first wife had died and when the second wife-to-be was still a maid in his house, and that he, Søren Kierkegaard, was probably begotten before his father and mother were married. And when he found this out, he was so shocked because his father had seemed such a pious and such a moral man that it would seem that just once he debauched himself, he went to a brothel, something of that sort, and then afterwards kept thinking about the relation between the sins of the fathers and the sins of the children, or somehow the father's sin was connected, as it obviously was psychologically in his case, with the sin of the son, who, when he finds out about the father's sin, does something himself that is sinful, and this set him to brooding about original sin. Not that he wouldn't have thought about that anyway, but there was this vivid personal connection in this, in his mind. And then he became engaged to a young girl, a very young girl, Regina, and finally decided that he couldn't go through with a marriage. And he felt that he couldn't say to her, I have some kind of a call. I think marriage might interfere with the sort of things that I have to do. Or he couldn't say to her, being somewhat crippled, I feel that I just can't consummate our marriage. I don't really want to get married. He felt that he couldn't be frank with her because she was so young. He felt that he couldn't share these awful memories of what his father had done, what he had done with her. And so he felt that perhaps the only way of bringing this unhappy relationship to an end was to lead her to want to break off the engagement by seeming to be a terribly frivolous person, blackening his own character so that she would want to break off the relationship. And here I have given you the major events of his life. These relatively few experiences, not in themselves perhaps really so terribly unusual, were for him fateful experiences that with an unusually sensitive soul he brooded over all his short life long and kept alluding to in one way or another in his many, many books. There are, I think, only two further episodes in his life to be added to round out the picture. One, which I find particularly moving, is that there was a paper in Copenhagen that praised him highly, that took a fancy to him. Here was a brilliant writer, and a writer with a fine sense of humor and a good stylist, and the paper praised him. And Kierkegaard despised this paper. And so he wrote the paper and said that he counted it a dishonor to be praised in its pages, and that in view of his opinion of this paper, he would much rather be pilloried by it. And the editor, perhaps understandably, took offense at this and ran in almost every issue horribly merciless cartoons of the misshapen, crippled Kierkegaard, making fun of him all the time until the children ran after him in the streets and threw rocks at him and laughed at him. But here you have a contempt for popularity and a contempt for the things that most people appreciate that I think requires a very profound respect. The other thing about his life that I still want to mention is that in the very end he came to the conclusion that the church of his country, which happened to be Lutheran, was so antithetical to what he took to be true Christianity and the heritage of Christ that he felt that one must openly protest against it. And so he privately printed pamphlets against the church, peddled them on the streets, collapsed in the street in the process of peddling them, was carried into a hospital where he lingered between life and death for a short while, refused to take the sacraments from an ordained minister of his church, said he would be willing to take them from a layman, but no layman was allowed to give him the sacraments. And so, although devoutly, intensely, passionately Christian, died without having taken the sacraments because he would not compromise with a church that he considered a betrayal of true religion. His books are exceedingly plentiful, and there's a point to be made about them. In the year 1843, for example, he published Either Or in 2 volumes. Then, in the same year, 18 edifying discourses. Then, in the same year, a book called Repetition. And then, still in the same year, Fear and Trembling. You might think that having published more than 5 volumes in 1 year, that he might have rested up during the following year, but in 1844 he published his philosophical fragments, his concept of dread, and another book. And in 1845, an enormous book, Stages on Life's Way. In 1846, his perhaps most ambitious work, concluding Unscientific Postscript. In 1847, more edifying discourses and his great works of love. In 1848, he wrote a book that he didn't publish. In 1849, he published The Sickness Unto Death, as well as 3 other books, and also completed 2 more books that he didn't publish that year, and that were published posthumously, and so it went. Here was a man, in other words, who wore himself out writing what he had to say, who did not divide his energies among any other things, though he had taken a theological degree. He did not become a minister. He did not want to have any official connection with the church, and just wrote at a feverish pace. Under the circumstances, it is perhaps not a carping criticism if I say that sometimes his writing leaves something to be desired from a philosophic point of view, that sometimes it is not as careful as it might be, that sometimes there are perhaps turns of phrase that invite objections, that sometimes perhaps he contradicts himself, that sometimes one can find fault. After all, if one writes at such a pace, so many books, not just in 1 year, but year after year after year, it is obvious that not everything is polished and as well considered as it might be. It has often been said, rightly, that Kierkegaard engaged in what is called indirect communication. And what is usually meant by that is that most of the books that I have just mentioned were not published over the name of Søren Kierkegaard, but over the name of rather odd, usually Latin pseudonyms. They were published by people with outrageous names. It was always obvious, because these names were Latin, that they couldn't be the real people, but all Copenhagen in those days was discussing, were all these pseudonyms one and the same man, or were there all sorts of different people? And Kierkegaard added to the mystification by having some pseudonyms attack others. And there are cross-references in these books, and this tickled his sense of humor. He thought this was funny. It is mildly funny, and this is called indirect communication. I don't think that that is really the heart of Kierkegaard's indirect communication. This is something that one might explain to some extent psychologically. One might say, isn't this continuous with what I told you about these walks that he took with his father, that here he, all alone in one room, peopled the world the way Richard II does in prison. All the world's a stage for him, and here are all these characters, all his inventions, and they engage in fights, and on some points they agree, and on some they disagree. You might almost say, without being disrespectful, this perhaps is part of his pathology. This is something that's psychologically odd and interesting. But this, I think, is not the crucial part of his indirect communication. The crucial part of the indirect communication is that Kierkegaard's mode of expression is artistic, that instead of always writing edifying discourses, as he sometimes did, instead of always coming right out and preaching, he often does the sort of thing that a novelist or a playwright does, that a man like Sartre will do too, namely, who avails himself of the mode of literature, of the mode of art, to get across his ideas a little less directly than one would if one came right out and told the reader. There are other features of a style that I think there's no need to go into in any detail here. It is, I think, an exasperating style, an outrageous style, an offensive style, and means to be so. To retell the story that in Genesis takes less than one full page about how Abraham went out to sacrifice Isaac but then didn't, Kierkegaard takes a whole little book, going over and over and over it again with variations. And he means to exasperate, he means to annoy, he means to upset, he does not mean just to entertain. In fact, that whole little book, Fear and Trembling, is directed against people who read Genesis and find it oh so interesting and oh so admirable, and don't ask themselves, what would I say if a man came along in my time who said, God has told me to sacrifice somebody else and I'm about to do it? This is the problem that Kierkegaard says we must ask ourselves about. We mustn't say, isn't it a beautiful story and how well written and how concise in style, and look how the emotions of father and son are caught so beautifully. That is an aesthetic approach. What Kierkegaard wants is the existential approach that asks, what would I do if I were in Abraham's shoes? What would I do if my next-door neighbor said that he was in Abraham's shoes and went out to kill somebody else because he thought that God had told him to? Now, what about the crisis in religion, to which I want to relate Kierkegaard? The crisis in religion in our time is so manifold that one could easily, obviously, give more than 3 lectures without even mentioning Kierkegaard just to analyze the crisis in religion. I will single out instead 3 aspects of the crisis in religion. One, because I think they are important, and two, because I think that Kierkegaard is interesting in relation to them. The first crisis in religion in our time, and I think perhaps the single most important point, is one that may strike you at first as being such old hat that it's hardly worth talking about. And that is the way in which science has undermined what we might call naive religious beliefs. Now you, for the most part, may consider this terribly old hat because you may feel that the beliefs that have been undermined by science are so naive that you obviously don't have these beliefs anymore. But for a moment, do just recapitulate in your own mind the familiar enough story of how beginning, say, with Copernicus and going on to Galileo and to Darwin and to Freud, again and again science has come into conflict with religion and has forced religious people to reinterpret their beliefs, to revise their beliefs. The crisis is that after this reinterpretation has been going on for a few hundred years, suddenly the question emerges, what now do these beliefs mean? If they don't contradict science, it is no longer obvious what they mean. To say that God created the world is very understandable as long as it contradicts some scientific theory or other. But if you say it doesn't contradict any scientific theory, there's nothing that science could possibly find out that could conflict with the belief that God created the world, then it becomes questionable what it means to say that God created the world. And so with other religious beliefs. The big problem, I suppose, for religious belief in our time is no longer quite so much what's the evidence for them or what's the evidence against them, because most people probably have redefined in such a way that evidence is no longer very clearly relevant to them. And in that what now do these beliefs mean? Instead of dwelling further on this point, I will proceed to what I take to be the second and the third aspect of the crisis, then say what I think Kierkegaard had to say on each of these points, and then leave it to you in our question and answer period after the lecture to probe any particular aspect that especially interests you. The second great crisis in religion is of a moral nature. If somebody says, and seriously means it, that whatever is in the Bible, whether that be defined as the Hebrew Bible only or as the Old and New Testament both, that whatever is in the Bible is the Word of God, and that all the moral commandments to be found in the Bible are imposed on us by God, then we have what seems morally a clear position. But that is not what the modern religious believer says. Whether people in the past have said quite that, I needn't go into right now. Here certainly we have an aspect of the religious crisis today that has its roots through the centuries, that's not completely new today. I do think it's more acute today than it has been in the past. People select much more consciously and much more individually now than they have ever done in the past what commandments they recognize and what commandments they don't recognize. If you confront people with some commandment in the Bible that is contrary to their conscience, Very few people, I think, are greatly disturbed by that anymore. They will just say, well, obviously that belongs to some very ancient strata of the Bible. That's an old idea, it's a primitive idea. That doesn't go for us anymore. Well, where is the crisis? All this seems very fine. The crisis is that if you are the one who does the choosing and picking as to which commandments are still binding on you, then what is the relevance of God to morality? What is the relevance of religion to morality? Aren't in that case religious believers and agnostics and atheists all in the same boat? In that case, they all find out what their morality is going to be, what their ethical code is going to be, by beginning with what they have been taught in the nursery, then revising that in the light of their own conscience, of their own experience, of their own reason, asking themselves more or less deliberately what stands up and what doesn't stand up under scrutiny. And then, very much as an afterthought, there's suddenly a difference between the religious person and the irreligious person. Namely, the religious person then suddenly says, and this, of course, I believe because the Bible says so. But to that extent, isn't the religious person deceiving himself? Is he really believing these things because the Bible says so? Apparently not, because there are other things in the Bible that he does not accept. Doesn't God then become redundant? Don't God and religion really, in that case, become irrelevant to life? And aren't they brought in a way that is not entirely honest anymore? This is the moral dimension of the religious crisis. And the third aspect is even more obviously age-old and I think not particularly modern, but it has its application in the 20th century and particularly since World War II. You might say that there is in organized religion an inverse proportion of quantity and quality. The more people crowd the temples and the churches, the shallower does religion become. This is not anything new, but it is something that's vividly illustrated in our time since World War II. But it is an old story. It's something that you find in the Hebrew Bible again and again and again, that the prophets are not greatly cheered by the fact that temple attendance is up higher than ever, that people are trampling the courts. On the contrary, this they find rather disgusting. They don't say, well, this is wonderful, there are more sacrifices now than there used to be. Now all we need is that we put in God we trust on our coins, or something of that sort, or if we had postage stamps that we cancel them, pray for peace. But what the prophets are concerned about is the terrible loss of quality of religion. And the prophets have a term for this, the remnant shall return, the idea that deep religion, genuine religion, is perhaps possible only for small groups. But this is an old idea. The idea, if you want to put it somewhat aggressively, which is appropriate if we want to connect this in a moment with Kierkegaard, that perhaps organized religion is something of a cancer, something that proliferates without aim and threatens to kill genuine religiousness. This may not be, this need not be, all there is to organized religion, but this is the awful danger of it. This is a perpetual crisis, and if we think about our time rather than thinking about biblical times, perhaps the last two very great religious figures who protested against the churches and against organized religion in the name of a religious vision of their own were Leo Tolstoy, who was excommunicated by the Greek Orthodox Church, and Søren Kierkegaard, who in a kind of a way broke with his own church. Now, If we then relate Kierkegaard to the crisis in religion, he is easiest to relate to this last point. He denounces organized religion, not necessarily in principle. He doesn't say there shouldn't be churches, but he thinks that the churches that exist in his own time in Denmark in the 1840s and 50s somehow don't come up to scratch at all. And if we look at what he criticizes the churches in his own country in the 19th century for, it is quite clear that his criticisms also apply at least as much, if not more, to the churches in our time. It is interesting in that connection that what he would like the churches to do is to be much more authoritarian. He attacks them because they don't lay down the law to people, because they are too liberal. But surely the same would apply to our churches today, which more or less take the attitude that as long as you go to any church or temple or something of the sort, it's all right, that any religious faith will do, no matter what it is, that one ought to have some faith in some organized religion or other, and let me be blunt, not take it too seriously. If you think that I'm myself not entirely serious about this, let me give an illustration that, even if you would find it mildly ridiculous, will bring out how dead serious I am about it. I don't think that the people of the United States today would stand for a presidential candidate who would not be affiliated with some organized religion. They do want their candidates to have some ties to some organized religion. But if Mr. Kennedy said, I take my Roman Catholicism seriously, he'd be through. And if Mr. Nixon were really a Quaker, instead of saying, I am in favor of fighting, then he would be through. What they want is a Quaker who is no Quaker and a Roman Catholic who is no Roman Catholic. It's in this sense that our revival of religion, emphasis on organized religion, is in a way a very shallow and misleading thing that has very little to do with deep religiousness. The person who is deeply religious would get into trouble in the United States today and certainly couldn't be elected to high office any more than the person who is openly atheistic. It's more complicated if we try to relate Kierkegaard to the other process, but still something can be said about these two. What about his attitude toward the meaning of religious beliefs when they no longer come into conflict with science? Kierkegaard's answer here is clear. He thinks that religious beliefs do conflict with science, that they must not be reinterpreted in such a way that they won't conflict with science. He thinks that religious beliefs, and the particular religious beliefs in which he is interested, those of Christianity as he understands it, are, to use the word that he uses again and again, absurd. It's Kierkegaard who introduced this word absurd into the vocabulary of existentialism, though it may be possibly more familiar to many of you from the writings of Albert Camus. No, religious beliefs, he thinks, Christian beliefs, are to reason absurd, and one must accept them nevertheless. One must humbly accept what one cannot comprehend. And one must oppose critical thinking. And one must be unscientific. And one must denounce science. One could go into great detail here and quote any number of texts in Kierkegaard, and if there should be any demand for that in the discussion period, I'm willing to do so. But I would also suggest, if you are willing, some of you, to do some reading on Kierkegaard, that you will find a good deal of material if you will read, let us say, at least two things: Kierkegaard's own book, Fear and Trembling, and perhaps by way of rounding out my lecture, to find information that I did not put into this lecture because it's available in print, Chapter 10, the chapter on Kierkegaard in my book From Shakespeare to Existentialism, a book, incidentally, that on the little folder that you got is credited to Miss Hazel Barnes. But I, in the bargain, was credited with a much bigger book, namely her The Literature of Possibility, which is published by the University of Nebraska. That is one mistake in this little bibliography. The last item there is Miss Barnes, and the one directly above that is mine. Both those books, Fear and Trembling and my From Shakespeare to Existentialism, are available in paperback, and by reading Fear and Trembling and my chapter on Kierkegaard, you will get a much fuller picture of Kierkegaard than you will just from this lecture alone. What about the moral selection? Here it is Kierkegaard's point that you have no right whatsoever to make any moral selection. You should not do that. That if God should tell you to sacrifice your own son, to commit murder, you have no right to say this cannot be God because this is contrary to conscience. Because if you do that, then God is reduced to a mere redundancy. Then you don't need God at all. Then you take the name of the Lord in vain by just introducing him afterwards to sanction what you believe anyway. No, you must countenance the possibility, if your religion is at all meaningful, you must countenance the possibility that religion may not only outrage your reason, but your conscience too. A very profound point, I think, for every religious person to ponder, whether if he does not countenance the possibility that God might go against conscience, God is not truly irrelevant to morality altogether. If conscience is supreme, then why do you need God in morality? If, on the other hand, you take God seriously in ethics, then there's the possibility that he might possibly go against conscience. Now, in conclusion, we are confronted with the oddity that if we consider what Kierkegaard has to say on these three aspects of the crisis, you will find him very probably unacceptable on at least two of the 3 points, perhaps on all three. Probably some of you will sympathize with this attitude toward organized religion, though some others of you will feel that it's too extreme. Probably very few of you will agree with him that religion ought to overrule reason and that one ought to believe things that are absurd. And perhaps, I don't know, none of you, or hardly any of you, will agree that religion could or should go against conscience. Is Kierkegaard then really just an outrageous fellow who has very strange and bizarre ideas, which after all are just interesting, but who doesn't really have much to say to us? That is not my view. I think that on all three of these points he deserves terribly serious consideration. One can, on all 3 points, obviously, accept pretty much what he says if one then draws the conclusion that religion is to be rejected for that very reason. He is much more of a thorn in the flesh, and meant to be, for the religious believer. But let me conclude this lecture by bringing out 3 points on which he seems to me to be particularly worthwhile. Number 1, we find in Kierkegaard, and particularly in that very difficult and abstruse book, The Sickness Unto Death, which comes together with Fear and Trembling in the same paperback volume, complete and unabridged, We find him saying in that almost all men are in despair, whether they know it or not, the one exception being the true Christian, if there should be any true Christian today. Now, this at first glance seems meaningless. Does it make any sense to say that somebody is in despair but he doesn't know it? This seems very strange. It seems as if he didn't know how to use language. Here you can try to defend him in two ways. The first way of defending him would be, if I may say so, the theological way, namely you redefine the terms. And this Kierkegaard does, sort of in passing, but if this were all there were to him, I personally wouldn't take him terribly seriously. He does say that despair can be defined as the wrong relationship to God. Well, of course, if you say that, then you can say that almost all men are in the wrong relationship to God, although they don't know it. There's no paradox about that. But then why call that despair? That's arbitrary, to save a paradox by redefining the terms. But Kierkegaard also says something much more interesting to my mind in the same book, namely that despair means being in a wrong relation to oneself. And might it not be the case that almost all men are in the wrong relationship to themselves, although they don't know it? That makes a lot of sense, and we can specify what this wrong relationship to themselves is. They are running away from themselves. They are trying to escape from themselves. And this surely is a profound analysis of modern man, and we can leave open the possibility that perhaps it's a profound analysis not only of modern man, possibly of men at all times. And Kierkegaard would say further that philosophy and science and society all help men to escape from themselves, all help men to run away from themselves. Men are afraid of being alone with themselves because they might encounter themselves. They're afraid of solitude. As Kierkegaard once puts it, they can't think of any better use for solitude than as a horrible punishment. So they seek togetherness. They seek community activities, and the churches help them. The churches become great centers for community activities. The churches help men to escape from themselves. Here I think we have point number one that's eminently worthwhile. Point number two is that he is against Hegel's dictum that our society is the freest that ever existed, and that what we should do is absorb its values and conform and believe in progress and be proud of our achievements. But surely that wasn't just the view of Hegel. That's the view of almost all our secondary school teachers in the United States today. And Kierkegaard says that this is a terrible view, that we should realize that this optimism is unfounded, that the true individual, the person who takes problems seriously, is in despair. His problems are not solved by science and society, and what you should do is not conform and not absorb the values of your society, but stand alone. That's point number two. And third and last, Kierkegaard's criticism of liberal Christianity and perhaps of liberal religion quite generally bears thinking about. And his interpretation of Christianity as deeply authoritarian, although perhaps not very appealing to the 20th century mind, might well be historically more correct than the more appealing interpretations to which we are accustomed today. When Kierkegaard says that Christianity is authoritarian, I think he is right. But he is also right when he says that Christianity teaches us to leave father and mother and to stand alone. That the original teaching of Jesus is not that the family that prays together stays together, but quite to the contrary, that you should not pray together, but that you should shut the door and pray by yourself. Here Kierkegaard speaks as a true heir, not just of Jesus, but perhaps of the prophets too. Let me end with a final dig against a very popular contrast today, with which probably most of you are familiar. that between the good guys and the bad guys, the authoritarians and the humanists, we classify people, and the authoritarians are the bad guys, and Kierkegaard clearly was authoritarian. You can quote him along that line again and again. And the humanists, they have the good beliefs. One thing that I will try to get across in all of these lectures, and quite emphatically today in the first one, is that one can learn a great deal from people who were authoritarian, and that Kierkegaard was one of them. We must not say people are black and white. Let's first see whether they are on the right side, and if they were, we will learn from them. But we may find that people who outrage us and to embarrass us and to annoy us and with whom we differ may be among the people from whom we have the most to learn. And that's one reason why I'm devoting these 3 lectures to 3 very outrageous people. Now, let's have questions. Please speak loudly enough that not only I can hear you, but other people too.
Before I came here tonight, I looked up the encyclopedia on the question of existentialism, and I learned that it is the problem of getting into a water crisis and imagining that it's solved, and then to get into another crisis. The life is that way on, but after tonight's lecture, I learned that existentialism rather is sort of a rebellion against accepted conditions. Would I be wrong or right?
If I understand the question right, you found somewhere that existentialism was defined as the belief that one just goes from crisis to crisis. I don't think that would be a very good definition of existentialism. This is not a point on which the people who are chiefly called existentialists have taken any particular stand, but you might say, and this is what I did try to say, that existentialists, instead of emphasizing what is ordinary and usual in life, emphasize the crises, and so give the impression that life consists very largely of crises. Between what? Oh. I must confess that I have not read Miss Rand's novels, but I understand that she is a great admirer of Nietzsche's, and so, if so, there probably is some connection, though obviously one should not read all of her ideas back into Nietzsche and either give him credit for them or blame him for them.
Would you think that Kierkegaard would be more apt to attack the Reformed religion than the Orthodox?
He very clearly did attack liberal and reformed religions. Now, what his attitude toward various forms of orthodoxy would be is a little bit difficult to say. One extraordinary thing I think about Kierkegaard is that he did not address himself to religions other than his own. That, for example, he never even writes about Calvinism. He treats Calvinism as non-existent. He does not discuss the Roman Catholic Church, much less does he discuss Orthodox Judaism. That by temperament he would have some feeling for orthodoxy that he wouldn't have for liberalism is clear, I think. But whether he would particularly applaud any such positions, I am not sure, because one thing that's very clear in Kierkegaard is that he does not share the admiration for organized religion as such, or for a deep religious faith, whatever that may be, that's so fashionable today, but he wants a particular interpretation of Christianity, and anything that doesn't agree with that he rejects. I think the answer is no, but the answer is also that that this is not a terribly relevant objection. Perhaps one doesn't have to worry about that too much.
alone, the human race would never have survived. And we are today at a certain stage in that stage of evolution, which goes back about 1 million years. Now, if we today don't follow that same pattern, we also can be extinct. So it is important, it's extremely important, and they are identical to your statement, which they laugh at.
Yes, but I think we haven't come to Sartre yet. We've talked about Kierkegaard today, and I think it would be fair to say that Kierkegaard is not too terribly worried any more than I would think Jesus was, and Kierkegaard is a Christian. He is not too terribly worried about whether mankind will survive or whether it will not survive. What he is worried about is the other world, is going to heaven. And what he concerns himself with, in line with a tradition that is strong in Christianity, and by no means totally absent from Judaism either, what he concerns himself with is what you might call the remnant, the exceptional individuals. Now, I'm not trying to say that you should accept this. There's something, as I've tried to bring out, deeply undemocratic about his whole attitude. He is not concerned about the greatest possible happiness of the greatest possible number. Not at all. What he is concerned with is how a man might become a good Christian, or if you want to put it differently, what the individual might have to do in order to be saved when he dies. This is something that's puzzling in many a reformer, that he revolts against the church, but then may add, and this is Kierkegaard's line clearly, that he revolts against it in part because it isn't authoritarian enough. So it's easy to sympathize with him because of his individualism, but you might say, if ever you got your way, if ever you got your will, what would happen to people like you? It's a similar feeling, just first of all by way of bringing out that this problem isn't confined to Kierkegaard, that one might have, for example, about a man like Plato, who criticizes the society that he lives in, Athenian democracy, because it isn't authoritarian enough, and he is a great rebel and a great individualist and a great iconoclast and a great critic. But what he would like to have is the kind of society in which people like he would have no place at all. Now we have something similar to that very clearly in Kierkegaard. And I think what he would say is that certain kinds of beliefs should be insisted on by the church, and that there should not be any leeway when it comes to whether you do or don't accept central dogmas about Christ, but that, of course, the individual might have some leeway in having some deep experience. What he objects to is a religion in which deep experience is something that would be an embarrassment, in which deep experience would almost disqualify anybody from membership because it just wouldn't belong, because it would be so extraordinary and exceptional. The deep experience is compatible, I should think, with a more authoritarian setup. Perhaps I can draw an analogy here which will be familiar to some of you, and that would be that perhaps in Orthodox Judaism, in religious services, you would be much more likely to see many people seized by stark religious experience than you would in more liberal services. And perhaps you would find the same sort of thing also between fundamentalist Protestant services and liberal services. The deepness and the intensity of the experience is compatible with a good deal of traditionalism and orthodoxy. I think that this is particularly frightful rather than being something that in any way can reconcile one to Kierkegaard. I think that with a strangely and disturbingly prophetic soul, he rightly sees that his knight of faith is not a fanatic with fire and sword, but the man who is willing to commit atrocities with a firm faith that everything will come out all right, and who, to be drastic about it, comes back, say, from his having liquidated a few million people to his family, and is a very nice father and a very nice husband, and, as Kierkegaard puts it, to quote him, in ordinary life you can't tell him from a tax collector. I think he is dead right about this, and I find it deeply disturbing, but most people are too romantic and too dramatic about it. They think that people who commit deeds like that must be obviously monsters, as if they sort of must have horns and tail. But Kierkegaard sees quite rightly that if a man has the firm faith that what he is doing is all right, and that in the end it will all be for the best, even though if you argue with him, he'll have to admit that it's absurd. How could it come out for the best? Still, he believes somehow it will. Then he can afterwards go back to his family and be quite undisturbed. Exactly, that's what I'm saying. But a man like Kierkegaard wistfully deplores his own rationality, his own integrity, his own conscience, saying, if I did a thing like that, I would not be able to go back. And instead of saying, that's because I am too decent a man, he says, that's because I don't have the kind of faith that one ought to have. At this point, obviously, I don't agree with him at all, and I don't suppose any of you had the idea in the first place during my lecture that I am in any sense a follower of Kierkegaard, even though I tried to give a sympathetic interpretation.
What explains the main interest that Kierkegaard has found among so many people today who really disagree with him? A man who is so contrary to the spirit of modern times.
Because it's much more fascinating to deal with somebody who deals with interesting problems that have some relation to one's own life than to read about things that strike one as wholly academic and irrelevant to one's own life. I think that's the main reason. A secondary reason is that he wrote well, and a tertiary reason is that there are some psychological insights that sort of spice the reading. There was a lady a little to the left there. Kierkegaard thought, and at this point I find him impossible to follow, he thought that the only way to transcend this despair was by being a good Christian. At this point I simply cannot follow. This doesn't make any sense to me at all. First of all, you might say, well, let's be a little bit more broad-minded. What about being a Jew, or what about being a Buddhist? Couldn't one transcend it in that way too? Or one might ask, what about being the kind of man, let's say, that we will come across as we consider Nietzsche and Sartre, familiar to some of you from Camus' novels? Might it not be possible without any religious faith? I think here Kierkegaard doesn't argue, but is just dogmatic, and to me, at this point, he isn't plausible at all. I can take just one more short question. I I don't see why the Orthodox Church, why a church that would measure up to Kierkegaard's expectations, would have to condemn Abraham. What Kierkegaard is saying, in effect, is the parson is a hypocrite if he praises Abraham Sunday morning, but Sunday afternoon, if a member of his congregation should go out to do likewise, would try to stop him. But now, why couldn't somebody first preach faith, and then if people also have got it, cheer them for it and be happy about it? I would say that the dreadful thing at this point is that the church so often has done again just what Kierkegaard wanted it to do, that people have preached to other people to go out and burn other people at the stake and kill other people, and then have not stopped them either, but quite consistently allowed them to go ahead with that. You're entirely right that according to Kierkegaard, Abraham couldn't communicate it, but the parson might do what Kierkegaard says he would do, just reverently stand back and say, here is a great man, here is the kind of man who resembles Abraham, let's canonize him. On that note, let's close for today. There was a question in the discussion last time, which was appropriately asked by a philosopher, that leads us straight into tonight's topic. The question was something like this: seeing that Kierkegaard held such terrible views, why should one study him? Now you may think, seeing that tonight's topic is Nietzsche and the crisis in philosophy, that I think that this question is very applicable to Nietzsche. I don't think so particularly. I don't think that his views, for the most part, were so terrible, though a few of them perhaps were. My point is that this question points straight toward the crisis in philosophy. Last week, when I spoke about Kierkegaard and the crisis in religion, I suggested that there were two factors in particular that accounted for the crisis in religion. One of those was a fairly obvious one in the case of religion, namely the emergence of scientific thinking, which has produced great problems for religion. The other factor was a more nearly timeless factor, namely organized religion poses a problem for the genuine religious spirit. I shall try to pursue both of these factors now in relation to philosophy and begin this lecture by talking about the crisis in philosophy before introducing Nietzsche. I do think that the first and chief factor of what I consider the crisis in contemporary philosophy has also been introduced by science. After all, if I understand the question rightly, it does show a considerable regard, which is very widely, if not quite universally, shared in our society, a very profound respect for science. In science, we don't study terrible views. In science, we don't deal with people of whom we think that they are clearly wrong. Philosophers today do, on the whole, want to be scientific. They want to emulate the sciences, not for any cheap motives, not because they want to have the same sort of prestige that scientists have, but for the best of motives. Science has made enormous progress for several centuries now, and incredible progress in the lifetime of most of us, and so one wonders whether philosophy could possibly do better than to imitate science. Now, where is there a crisis here? Here I think philosophers are one up on the theologians. It's perhaps one of the few areas where their one-upmanship exceeds that of the theologians. And what the theologians would admit, I think, to be a crisis in philosophy, the philosophers call a revolution in philosophy, and that, in spite of the Un-American Activities Committee, sounds rather good. A revolution in philosophy suggests progress in philosophy, and something that we need not worry about. But there is a crisis in philosophy here. One way, I think, that I can illustrate it is with a story of which I'm not at all sure whether it is true, although I've heard it from many sides. I shall therefore not name the philosopher in question about whom this story is often told. The point is that he is an outstanding logical positivist, and that he supposedly was offered a chair of philosophy at one of our leading universities and did not accept the last minute because supposedly, and this is hard to credit, one of the requirements was that he should, among other things, teach an introductory course on Plato, and he is supposed to have replied, "I will teach only the truth." Now here you have, I think, the same point that I've been dealing with. Why teach terrible views? And Plato did have some views that few of us would accept, even some views in political philosophy that many of us might consider terrible. And here now is the crisis. If a philosopher wants to be scientific, if he does not want to teach things that are not true, if he most certainly does not want to teach things that are terrible, what becomes of practically all the philosophy we have got? What becomes of philosophy from the pre-Socratics and Plato and Aristotle right down to the 20th century? Should it all be rejected? Well, if so, then surely we have reached a crisis in philosophy if philosophers have reached the point where they think that all philosophy so far, or at least most of it, almost all of it, has been one huge mistake. The question immediately arises, of course, if you throw out so very, very much, what is to replace it? The early logical positivists thought that they had a good criterion for telling what could stay and what could not stay. Only that was supposed to stay, only that was recognized as meaningful, which could be verified, and whatever was not verifiable was meaningless, as one supposed in those days, shortly after World War I, and was to be eliminated. And what was left, in fact, was something very different from most of traditional philosophy. Things like philosophy of religion and metaphysics and aesthetics, all that went out the window, and good work was done, important work was done in areas like philosophy of science and logic, especially in those two fields. Ludwig Wittgenstein, who had done as much as any man to inspire logical positivism, drew the really consistent conclusion at that point. After publishing his first book, the so-called Tractatus, in which he thought that he had solved all philosophic problems by showing that most of them were meaningless, he left philosophy. He was a very wonderful man. He had inherited great wealth. He distributed all among the poor and became a village teacher and then a gardener's assistant. And then as more and more people accepted his book and his early views, he decided that something must be wrong with them. And so he went back to philosophy, to a second very illustrious career, becoming a professor, though Austrian-born, becoming a professor at the University of Cambridge in England and influencing the second phase of positivism, which is more usually called analytic philosophy, and which today dominates English-speaking philosophy, both in the British Isles, particularly in England, less so in Scotland, and in the United States too. This has been characterized in a little book on English philosophy since 1900 by Geoffrey Warnock, when he says, and what he says here is false, unless we keep in mind that he is talking about English philosophy since 1900. He says, it is at any rate certain that questions of belief, questions of religious, moral, political, or generally cosmic variety, cosmic he puts into sneer quotes, are seldom, if at all, directly dealt with in contemporary philosophy. Why is this so? The first part of an answer to this question can easily be given. There's a very large number of questions, not of that variety, which philosophers find themselves more interested in discussing. I think as far as English-speaking philosophy goes, this is a pardonable generalization. There's a great deal of truth in it, even though it isn't literally correct. And if we ask ourselves now, why this shift of interest? It doesn't seem to be true of society generally that it is no longer interested in questions of religious, moral, political variety. People are quite interested in those. Why aren't philosophers interested in them anymore? I think the answer, the chief answer, answer number one at any rate, is they want to be scientific. They want to obtain agreement on facts. They are embarrassed by disagreement among philosophers, and they despair, sensibly, of obtaining agreement on questions of religious, moral, political, and cosmic variety. So it is the attempt to emulate the sciences that has in one way or another led the vast majority of English-speaking philosophers to abandon the traditional concerns of philosophers and to make a great shift. There are other reasons here which lead me to the second factor, but let me begin by still subsuming them under the attempt to emulate the sciences. One feels that everybody should be able to make some contribution, that the progress in the sciences is made piecemeal by many people doing little things, and so in philosophy too there should be a comparable situation. And when one of the outstanding living English philosophers, Gilbert Ryle, suggests that the analysis of what he calls systematically misleading expressions, and I quote an early essay of his, is what philosophical analysis is, and this is the sole and whole function of philosophy, he is motivated partly, I think, by a desire for something that can be done with precision and accuracy. He is also motivated by the desire of staking out some area in which philosophy will not conflict with science, not be shown up by the progress of science, but on the contrary, where it will be possible for many competent people to make contributions and conceivably even to engage in teamwork of a sort. To mention another equally outstanding British philosopher who died recently, J.L. Austin, he varied the interests of Ryle somewhat by concentrating very largely on things that bordered on lexicography, semantic analysis, analyzing distinctions in ordinary language, hoping that where there are subtle distinctions between words that are apparently synonymous, perhaps some important difference is hidden that might eventually become philosophically important or fruitful, but he found this kind of precise work so absorbing that he very, very rarely indeed bothered to point up its philosophic relevance. The point here is, again, to do something that can be done with precision, to do something that does not involve inspiration but competence, in other words, to emulate the sciences. Now I have said that the other factor, the factor of organization, has also helped to produce the crisis in philosophy, and this, I think, is, if anything, even less obvious than my first point, that science poses a deep and critical problem for philosophy. After all, happily, We don't have organization in philosophy the way we do have it in religion. There's nothing at all unusual for a philosopher going it alone. Of course, there are some little clubs where people get together who happen to agree particularly with each other, but that is the exception rather than the rule. And the whole philosophy is lucky in not being beset by hierarchies and organizations and all that sort of thing. But in another sense, philosophy has become organized. Let's put the point this way. What I've been saying about philosophy, relinquishing problems of religious and political and cosmic and moral variety so very largely, and becoming so very preoccupied with questions of method, of science, of logic, amounts to saying that philosophy has become, in the 20th century, exceedingly academic. And if we ask why philosophy has become so terribly academic, surely a very important part of the answer is that philosophy has become academic because almost all philosophers are in academies. The organizations in question are our colleges and universities. We take it for granted that, of course, if a man says, and is in his right mind, that he is a philosopher, that presumably he means that he teaches philosophy at some college or university. But if we think back a few centuries, that of course did not used to be so. People like Descartes and Locke and Hobbes and Berkeley and Hume and Spinoza, they were not professors. They did not have university jobs, and this surely makes a big difference. It does not make all of the difference by itself. We can be more precise here. We can almost be scientific. We can quantify the point. And we can say that the really crucial point about organization is that where formerly, at any one time, in any one generation, there were maybe half a dozen or at most a dozen philosophers, today there are quite literally many thousands. That's no exaggeration. All you have to do is to take some such dictionary as Webster's Collegiate, look up in the back the list of colleges. I think you will find that in the United States alone there are over 1,000 colleges and universities, and most of them have more than one philosopher. Some of them have over a dozen philosophers, which means that in the United States alone you have thousands of philosophers. But this is an entirely new situation which is bound to change the whole tone of philosophy. The unit of publication, for example, can no longer be the book. Nobody has time to read books by thousands and thousands of philosophers. Something new has to be invented to take care of this situation, the scholarly journal. I'm not trying to make fun of this. Perhaps in some way the situation is amusing, but we have here a perfectly reasonable development. There are these thousands of people. They live spread out over a huge country. They can't constantly get together and see each other face to face and talk with each other. How are they going to make each other aware that they are alive physically, that they are alive intellectually, that they have something to say? They have to be scholarly, professional journals in which people write articles of which other people can take note. And these articles, for the most part, are written for what has been called, rightly, fellow craftsmen, fellow technicians, other people who are professionals in the field. Well, if a man like Spinoza had written just for fellow philosophers, there wouldn't have been any need to print his books. He could have circulated them in manuscript, and within 2 years, all the fellow philosophers around could easily have read them. This wasn't so just in Spinoza's time, but this was so for a long time while philosophy flourished. But these philosophers did not just address this minute audience of maybe 6 or 12 other philosophers, that was all there was in those days, but they addressed the layman too, and so they didn't deal just with academic points, but they dealt with questions that mattered to people generally. While today, most professional philosophers lean over backwards not to do that. Take a young man in his 20s who in the 18th century wrote a book with the title Treatise of Human Nature, being an attempt to introduce the experimental method of reasoning into moral subjects. His name was David Hume, and the book that he wrote was a great book, which is still studied. But what young professional philosopher in his 20s would dare write a book with a title like that and try to cover so many subjects in a single book? It so happened that Hume's book was initially not a success, but fell stillborn from the presses, as he himself put it. But in time, it had an enormous impact. Here then we have the contrast. And we actually find some of the professional philosophers, Warnock, for example, in his little book on English philosophy since 1900, making fun, without naming names, of the amateurs of former ages and extolling the professional philosophers of our time. I feel that the shoe is a little bit on the other foot, and that amateurs like, for example, Hume and Berkeley, who published their major works when they were still in their 20s, are not people for us to look down on. And I dare say that the reason why young philosophers today don't write books like that is not because those books were so amateurish and so bad, but rather because they were so extremely bold. Now, this is a good point, I think, to introduce the philosopher of the evening, and I will do it with a quotation that relates in immediately to what I have characterized as the crisis in philosophy. Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, section 212, which is reprinted or translated in full in the portable Nietzsche, that traditionally the great philosopher has always stood in opposition to his today. I'm abbreviating the section. The great philosopher traditionally has stood in opposition to his today. Philosophers have been the bad conscience of their time. They knew of a new greatness of man, of a new untrodden way to his enhancement. Confronted with a world of modern ideas, which would banish everybody into a corner and a specialty, a philosopher, if there could be any philosophers today, would be forced to define the greatness of man, the concept of greatness, in terms precisely of man's comprehensiveness and multiplicity, his wholeness and manifoldness. Then Nietzsche gives some illustrations of 16th century philosophers, goes on to talk a little bit about Socrates, and continues, today, conversely, when only the herd animal is honored and dispenses honors in Europe, and when equality of rights could all too easily be converted into an equality in violating rights, by that I mean into a common war on all that is rare, strange, or privileged, on the higher man, the higher soul, the higher duty, the higher responsibility, and on the wealth of creative power and mastery, today the concept of greatness entails being noble, wanting to be by oneself, being capable of being different, standing alone, and having to live independently. Thus, in 1886, Ludwig Wittgenstein would not only have understood, but I think would have agreed very largely. He too, by temperament, was a man who was different, stood alone, lived independently. But on the whole, certainly ordinary language philosophy, linguistic philosophy, analytic philosophy, whatever we shall call it, is not very much in sympathy with the sentiments expressed by Nietzsche here, but on the contrary, an example of what you might call counter-revolutionary philosophy, not really a revolution in philosophy. Traditionally, the philosopher has been a revolutionary, a heretic, who stood in opposition to us today. But linguistic philosophy has an influence that leads men away from trying to stand alone. It would indeed, as Nietzsche puts it, banish philosophers into a corner and a specialty. It teaches young philosophers not to become heretics, not to become revolutionaries, because it wouldn't be scientific, and they really don't have any special competence that qualifies them for that role. Nietzsche might well have said that it might be a philosopher's business, if there could be any philosophers today, to acquire such a competence. And if you should say, well, it would be terrible if we trained all our young philosophers to become revolutionaries of this sort, this would just bring intellectual chaos, the answer would be that if you decide that nobody should even try things that not everybody can do, surely that would amount to what Nietzsche calls a common war on all that is rare, strange, or privileged, on the higher man, the higher soul, the higher duty, the higher responsibility. Now here we have Nietzsche, another man who is widely considered to be a man with terrible views, even more so than Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard really isn't considered that. It was just I who, out of pure cussedness, brought out that Kierkegaard really had some views that would strike many people as terrible, some of which somehow I take perverse pleasure in. I sort of think that they're thought-provoking, that they make us rethink things that we had taken for granted, that even where I cannot agree with him at all, I learn something from him because he makes me reflect on things that otherwise I might not have reflected on. And Nietzsche, on the other hand, because everybody thinks that he has such terrible views, I sort of swim against the stream here too, by trying to point out that his views really weren't quite so terrible, and what I just read you is a good example. Some people get their hackles up as soon as they hear Nietzsche speaking about the herd animal. This shows his being undemocratic and all that sort of thing. But if you listen once more to the words that I just read you, I wonder whether most of you wouldn't agree that what he characterizes here is precisely some of the most disgraceful things that have happened in our own democracy since World War II, namely that an equality of rights could all too easily be converted into an equality in violating rights, into a common war on all that is rare, strange, or privileged, on the higher man, the higher soul, the higher duty, the higher responsibility, and on the wealth of creative power and mastery. We've had a lot of that since World War II. But let us generalize and not engage at this point in any special pleading for Nietzsche. Let's say, all right, he did have some terrible views, like Kierkegaard and like Plato and like Homer and like Dante and like Dostoevsky, all people who are terribly worth reading and who had perfectly dreadful ideas about all sorts of things. Homer obviously took a great delight in cruelty, thought that it was terribly funny to beat up a hunchback. Dante's sense of humor was even much more gruesome than that. And if it wasn't humor, it's even worse. And in Dostoevsky's case, perhaps some of you are not aware of some of his perfectly dreadful opinions. Here then is the question, is philosophy perhaps in some sense closer to literature than to science? In literature, certainly, we don't consider it necessary for a great writer first to assure us that he has wholesome views. Is philosophy similar to that? Well, perhaps at least partly so. Perhaps there are some similarities between philosophy and poetry, philosophy and literature. Men share what Tolstoy once called a fear to understand things that clash with their own customs, privileges, or beliefs. I think we all share that fear. Some of us are a little more housebroken than others. Some of us have mastered this fear to some extent. Some of us perhaps are never conscious of this fear, but still, I think all of us find, if we are very honest with ourselves, that on occasion we don't try very hard to understand things that clash with our own customs, privileges, or beliefs. And just as it is one of the functions of literature to force us to enter into ideas, views that clash with our customs, privileges, and beliefs, so philosophers too might have this job, among others, to make men more sensitive to other points of view, to show men how an outlook that's widely slandered and despised looks and feels from inside. To that extent, a philosopher, I think, is closer to an artist, and particularly a novelist or a dramatist, than he is to a scientist. Now, there are differences, however. A novelist or a dramatist may occasionally examine an argument. He really doesn't have to. A philosopher constantly has to evaluate the arguments for and against alternative positions. And this can be quite thrilling. This can be quite interesting to do this. This is an important part of philosophy. The point that I'm making is not particularly original or revolutionary in our time. It was made long ago by Socrates in that perhaps most famous saying of his, that the unexamined life is not worth living. It's part of the function of a philosopher to lead people to examine their lives. And one way of doing that is by being provocative, by provoking people, by offering them terrible views to make them think. Wittgenstein has put this point beautifully, if only in a posthumously published letter to a younger friend and student. I'll quote it. What is the use of studying philosophy if all that it does for you is to enable you to talk with some plausibility about some abstruse questions of logic, etc., and if it does not improve your thinking about the important questions of everyday life, if it does not make you more conscientious? I know that it's difficult to think well about certainty, probability, perception, etc., but it is, if possible, still more difficult to think or try to think really honestly about your life and other people's lives. And the trouble is that thinking about these things is often downright nasty. And when it's nasty, then it's most important. I find this a terribly moving letter. I think Wittgenstein himself, on this particular point, didn't practice what he preached. I think Nietzsche did practice what Wittgenstein here preached. He was nasty enough, I think, to suit any of you. But nasty not just for the sake of being nasty, but nasty because he tried to think really honestly about his own life and other people's lives. Nietzsche himself put the same point a number of times. One of his briefest formulations is that he said that it was a very trite idea to have the courage of one's convictions. What really mattered was to have the courage for an attack on one's convictions, which is another way of saying, in his somewhat more aggressive manner, the courage to examine one's convictions, the courage to re-examine one's convictions, the courage to ask whether there isn't something wrong with them. You find the same thing beautifully expressed in a letter to a sister right at the beginning of the portable Nietzsche, where he says, here the ways of men part. If you want peace of mind, then believe, and if you want to have the truth, then inquire, and where he pictures how difficult a way of life it may be if you inquire, how often you are bound to be unsure, how often your conscience is apt to bother you, how often you may live in what Kierkegaard might have called fear and trembling. I think what makes Nietzsche particularly remarkable is that he is a rare embodiment of what I consider the philosophic, the Socratic philosophic spirit. There may be some things about his personality that are not so attractive. In this respect, I think he is thoroughly admirable in his uninhibited passion for truth and in his rarely equaled craving for intellectual integrity. These are rare qualities. They are not often encountered. I'll be terribly brief about his life and about his personality. Some of the major points may be very well known to most of you, and so there's no need to dwell on them. One thing that's mildly interesting is that Nietzsche's father was born the same year as Kierkegaard, in 1813. I just mention it because it indicates that Nietzsche is really one generation later. He didn't read Kierkegaard. Georg Brandes, who was the first to discover Nietzsche and one of the first to discover Kierkegaard and also helped to discover such people as Ibsen and as Strindberg, called Nietzsche's attention to Kierkegaard in a letter just at the end of Nietzsche's life, and Nietzsche didn't get around anymore to procuring any of Kierkegaard's works. Nietzsche himself was born in 1844 and died in 1900. His father died when he was a little boy. He was brought up by his mother together with his sister and also with the benefit of a grandmother and two maiden aunts. Eventually escaped to the university where he studied classical philology, and at the very young age of not yet 25 became a professor of classical philology at the University of Basel, Switzerland. The greatest experience of his Basel period, of his period as a professor, was his temporary friendship with Richard Wagner, also, if I remember right, born in 1813, also of the generation of Nietzsche's father, a very asymmetrical friendship in which Wagner appreciated the young intellectual who was his errand boy, bought Christmas presents for the family, could be persuaded to append to his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, a long, very purple prosy eulogy of Richard Wagner, and that was appreciated by Wagner at a time when Wagner was not much appreciated. But sooner or later, this relationship had to come to an end, even if the particular things that did happen hadn't happened, because Wagner had no interest in Nietzsche striving for intellectual independence, had no sympathy at all for Nietzsche's particularly personal aspirations, so that Nietzsche could either give those up permanently and just become a publicity man for Wagner, or had to break with Wagner. He did the latter. It happened after Wagner went to Bayreuth and established there a great center of Wagnerism, also of anti-Semitism and Francophobia and all sorts of political ideas that Nietzsche didn't like. The capstone, as many of you know, was when Wagner wrote Parsifal, which Nietzsche thought was a very unpleasant affair, because he did not for a moment think that Wagner really now had faith, but felt that the old atheist who had prided himself on his atheism and called himself Schopenhauer's first disciple, and also a modern Aeschylus, that this man now was using Christianity and the idea of the pure fool, a very un-Greek idea, for theatrical effect. So they broke. Nietzsche, shortly after, also resigned from the university and then lived for another 10 years in relative poverty in Switzerland and Italy most of the time, Switzerland in the summers, Italy in the winters, and his heroism, which I think was very real, was very different from those immediately, from those terribly theatrical busts and drawings that you have seen with the huge moustaches that were commissioned by the sister after he had become insane and was an imbecile and could not protest. His heroism consisted in the fact that his health was terrible, that the doctors kept advising him to take it easy, to take care of his eyes, not to read so much, not to write so much, and that he burnt himself out publishing, not like Kierkegaard, so many books a year, but quite steadily one book a year, and put everything into that until there was nothing left of him anymore, and he became insane. The insanity, according to most of the people who have studied it posthumously, was probably a general paralysis, in which case there must presumably have been a syphilitic infection. Those who have studied the matter dispassionately have charged that Nietzsche may, as a student, once or twice have visited a brothel. This is not well attested, but it certainly is very possible. It's also possible, not that it greatly matters to me, I don't see why it should matter to you, that when he was a medical orderly during the Franco-Prussian War, he might have become infected as he was taking care of sick soldiers. What does matter, what is relevant, is whether Nietzsche's works can be shrugged off as the writings of a madman. And this is a popular idea with people who don't know much psychology, with amateur psychologists, but perhaps it's interesting to hear what Freud thought of Nietzsche. Freud said of Nietzsche that he had, and I quote, a more penetrating knowledge of himself than any other man who ever lived or was ever likely to live. Rather a handsome compliment. I think I'm not at all sure that it's true, but I find it quite stunning anyway, that he had a more penetrating knowledge of himself than any other man who ever lived or was ever likely to live. That presumably includes Sigmund Freud himself. He also said of Nietzsche that his insights often agree in the most amazing manner with the laborious results of psychoanalysis. And that, although in his later years, Freud didn't have any particular enthusiasm for Nietzsche, whose whole temperament was very different from his own in many respects. There's no need, I think, to go over a list here of Nietzsche's books. They're usually divided into three periods. First, things like The Birth of Tragedy and The Untimely Meditations, essays, then as aphoristic works, the ones that really are aphoristic, that consist of lots of short sections strung together, and then in his final period, first Thus Spoke Zarathustra, then Beyond Good and Evil, Genealogy of Morals, and then finally, in his last conscious year, 1888, he equaled Kierkegaard by writing in 1 year The Case of Wagner, The Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, Ecce Homo, and composing out of things written earlier, Nietzsche contra Wagner. Now, there is an enormous amount to be said about Nietzsche's philosophy, which I shall not say tonight, and perhaps this is a good moment to give you briefly some bibliographical suggestions for Nietzsche and for this whole series of 3 lectures. If you are willing to look at 2 books, assuming that you haven't already read one or both, the 2 that I would advise, both in connection with Nietzsche and with this whole section of 3, and in terms of which I think you would get much more out of the whole series than if you just listen to the lectures, are Existentialism from Dostoevsky to Sartre, mainly for texts by the men themselves, and my From Shakespeare to Existentialism for interpretations of the men, including Nietzsche. For Kierkegaard, if you want to do some additional reading, I would say the work of his to read is Fear and Trembling, the work about him to read, which also is available, like everything I am mentioning, in paperback. Walter Lowry's Short Life of Kierkegaard, which is enormously sympathetic and I think illuminating. That's a paperback by the Princeton University Press. The others are respectively Anchor and Meridian. For Nietzsche, for the texts, the portable Nietzsche, there are some important works that are in the modern library giant Nietzsche and not in the portable, and vice versa for that matter. I do think that some of the translations in the modern library giant are travesties. For an interpretation of Nietzsche that covers points that I shall not bring up tonight, there's my own little Meridian book on Nietzsche. And for Sartre, whom I want to discuss next week, if you want to read one thing by him, in addition to the things in Existentialism from Dostoevsky to Sartre, I'd suggest No Exit and 3 other plays, and preferably of those, No Exit and The Flies. And if you're willing to tackle a big university press book, that is a very good secondary text on French existentialism, Hazel Barnes, The Literature of Possibility. Now, to speak briefly about Nietzsche's philosophy, I will first mention 2 major misconceptions of Nietzsche. One of them, Nietzsche as a Nazi, a view that used to be popular in this country during World War II, but also was popular in Germany just preceding World War II, although I think not quite as popular really in Germany as here, because more people in Germany knew their Nietzsche, had read them, and knew how many things there were in Nietzsche that didn't square with Nazism. And I dare say that this view is quite universally abandoned by Nietzsche scholars. I don't think that on this, I wouldn't be afraid to say so if I stood alone on this and if I thought I was right against the world, but that is not the situation. In fact, I think that Nietzsche scholars are pretty well agreed that this is a very serious misreading of Nietzsche, that Nietzsche, to give a couple of examples, did not say, my ideal is Cesare Borgia, but he said that he liked even Cesare Borgia better than Parzival, and that wasn't saying very much coming from Nietzsche. Or when he spoke of the blonde beast, which he did, I think, all of 3 times, he had in mind by the blonde beast a lion, and was referring to the brute health and strength of the Teutonic races before they became Christianized. He did think there was something nice about a lion, but if you want to know what he really seriously as a philosopher thought of the blonde beast and of the lion, you need read no further than the first chapter. I mean the first chapter now and not the prologue of Zarathustra, where you get the image of the lion as not the highest thing. There are 3 transformations or metamorphoses, and the first one is the camel, the beast of burden that humbly accepts tradition, then the lion, the beast, the revolutionary that throws it off, and finally the creative child. And so for Nietzsche, quite generally, there's not high-handed exegesis, but quite generally, the blonde beast was very far from being his ideal. And so one could run through various other slogans that have been misinterpreted. I won't do it now. In the chapter on how Nietzsche revolutionized morals from Shakespeare to existentialism, you will find a very brief treatment, one after the other, of these major misconceptions. The only other one that I do want to mention is that among those who have given up any notion that Nietzsche was a Nazi are those who have developed about him what you might call the incoherence theory, namely that he was completely incoherent and that he said absolutely anything on any subject that just happened to come to his mind. In a kind of rarefied or sublimated way, this theory is championed by Karl Jaspers, who sees Nietzsche in some such way and sees great glory in this. He thinks this is a wonderful thing because whatever position you may adopt, Nietzsche sort of shocks you out of it by saying something else, and so you are, in Jaspers' words, set whirling. Now, if one reads Nietzsche the way Karl Jaspers reads him, which is by way of file cards that you write down juicy quotations, and then you sort of look now at this and now at that, you can be set whirling, that's very true, but You can do something like that, not quite so easily, but quite a number of writers. In fact, with all writers of very great scope, perhaps. Certainly you could do it with Plato, for example. I think that Nietzsche isn't as incoherent as all that there is in Nietzsche a coherent doctrine. The other existentialists agree on that. Heidegger finds a coherent doctrine in him, albeit one that I don't find in him. Sartre and Camus, I think, find some coherence in him, so do any number of people. Now, I will briefly mention some of these doctrines at least, and I will dwell relatively longest, I'll be brief on all of these points, on Nietzsche's psychology. This relates him, as most of the things that I am stressing do, even if I don't keep emphasizing it in every sentence, this relates him to existentialism. What the existentialists have in common is their concern with human nature, with human existence. Now, psychology has been a traditional concern of philosophers. Plato was interested in psychology, Aristotle was, Spinoza was in a big way, Hume was, as I mentioned before. But in Nietzsche there are several innovations. The first one is that he quite deliberately puts his conception of man, both of man as he is and of man as he might be, quite emphatically in the center of his thought, and coins a word for his idea of man as he might be. The word in German is Übermensch. In English this has sometimes been translated in a word that has become debased currency, Superman. It's better, I think, for a variety of reasons to use the word overman for it. Moreover, still much more interesting, Nietzsche, in considering the views of others, in his literary criticism, in his criticism of religion, and in his criticism of philosophers, looks for their visions of man, looks for the visions of man that they presuppose, perhaps unconsciously, explicates these hidden visions of man in other people's philosophies, and then criticizes them. And he bases his psychology on a much broader empirical fundament than I think any philosopher before him, which is what earned him Freud's compliments. His own major psychological concepts have been, I think, insufficiently studied and contrasted with those of Freud and Freud's successors. The chief ones are, first of all, the conception of the will to power. The will to power, as understood by Nietzsche, is by no means just the vulgar sort of striving for power, which finds expression in militarism and imperialism. Nietzsche was as sharp a critic of the Bismarck Empire as that empire produced. He had no admiration for that sort of thing at all, but descriptively found in that too, of course, an expression of a will to power, but he also found the will to power everywhere else. He found it in Christianity in a peculiar form, he thought, and he could quote St. Thomas Aquinas and any number of other great saints along these lines, that the Christian, having despaired of this world, hopes to go to heaven, and then from heaven behold the torments of his masters, of his enemies in hell. He too wants power, but having despaired of power in this world, seeks power in another world. The artist too seeks power, the philosopher too seeks power. We have here as comprehensive a monistic theory as we find in the early Freud, and a theory that might well be weighed in the balance against the dualism of the older Freud. Just as when Freud tried to supposedly explain everything in terms of sex, this meant that in fact he reinterpreted the traditional idea of sex, that what he finally meant by the sex impulse was something much less crude than what some other people had meant. So what Nietzsche means when he speaks of the will to power is also something just a little more subtle, something a little more polymorphic, something a little more protean, and just as Freud could hardly be said by an intelligent person to have endorsed or celebrated the sex impulse, so it is stupid, I think, to say of Nietzsche that he endorsed or celebrated the will to power. Another conception, psychological conception of Nietzsche's, which bears out what I've just said about the will to power, is the conception of sublimation. It was Nietzsche who first used that word sublimation in its contemporary sense, and his whole conception of the will to power, his whole psychology of the will to power depends on this idea of substitutions, that people again and again settle for what is second best, that when they can't get what they most want, then they will settle for brute power, for physical power, for cruelty, which isn't what they really want, but what is, in modern terminology, to be explained in terms of frustration. Nietzsche's key word here is the word resentment, and he finds resentment central in Christianity and finds resentment central in a great deal of traditional morality. And he initiates something for which Karl Jaspers coined a nice title in one of his early books, namely Psychology of Weltanschauungen, to look at Weltanschauungen and understand the psychological bases of them. Now, what I might do, but definitely shall not do, at least in the lecture part, if you want to bring it out in discussion, all right, is deal specifically with Nietzsche on religion, to tie it up with last week's lecture, and with Nietzsche on morality, to tie it up with next week's lecture. The reason I will not do this is because I see no point in repeating in a lecture what I have written and published. So for those particularly interested in Nietzsche on religion, I may mention the chapter on Nietzsche's repudiation of Christ in my little book on Nietzsche. For those interested in Nietzsche and morality, the chapter already mentioned on how Nietzsche revolutionized morals in From Shakespeare to Existentialism. What I still want to say about Nietzsche's philosophy is that perhaps one can illuminate it by suggesting that there are three different types of philosophy encountered in Nietzsche. First of all, the traditional kind of philosophy, which I think in understanding Nietzsche is least important, though Heidegger, very perversely to my mind, stresses this and only this in his essay on Nietzsche, in his essay, not translated into English, on Nietzsche's word, God is dead. And this is the metaphysician in Nietzsche. He thinks that Heidegger thinks that Nietzsche was the last great metaphysician of the West. Plato, perhaps the first, and Nietzsche the last. Well, there is some metaphysics in Nietzsche. The will to power does become, in the late Nietzsche, also, among other things, on top of everything else, a metaphysical hypothesis. He has to out Schopenhauer, and say Schopenhauer thought the ultimate reality was the will to live. No, it isn't that, it is the will to power. But I think this is a wholly marginal part of Nietzsche's philosophy. The two parts in Nietzsche's philosophy that are strong are, one, the analytic, and two, the existential. And this is what I have in mind when I think of Nietzsche as not himself a clear-cut existentialist, but as sort of the watershed, the last great world historical philosopher in whom these two timeless tendencies are still very well fused. Well, in our time, there has been a dissociation of sensibility, and we have the analyst speaking English and the existentialist speaking German and French. Let me illustrate the analytic element in Nietzsche very briefly, and I will stress here particularly things that have to do with emphasis on language and grammar to link him with what's going on in analytic philosophy today. You find, for example, as analytic philosophy, his analyses of God, of the true world, of morality, of the good, of the four great errors, all in the twilight of the idols contained in the portable Nietzsche. You find them saying such things as, language talks of opposites, but there are only degrees and many refinements of gradation. He speaks of the misleading errors of language and the fundamental fallacies of reason which have become petrified in language, which understands and misunderstands all activity as due to an agent, a subject. Again, he says that when there is thinking, something must exist that does think is simply a formulation of our grammatical habits which couple all doing with a doer. There's plenty of this sort of thing in Nietzsche, which you might call anti-metaphysical and positivistic. But there is, of course, in Nietzsche also a great deal that links him with existentialism, and I'll just enumerate. His literary criticism, something in which Heidegger, Sartre, and Camus have also engaged in a big way. His psychological interests, his critique of Christianity and of Weltanschauungen generally. His analysis of nihilism and of different possible attitudes toward an absurd world, particularly relevant to the sort of thing that Sartre and Camus have done. His celebration that I've read to you of a new greatness of man, and his attempt to cross over from philosophy into literary attempts. It is therefore not surprising that Karl Jaspers should have written 2 books about Nietzsche, that Heidegger should have written an important essay about him, that Nietzsche's name should be the first name mentioned in Sartre's Being and Nothingness, and that Camus has written at length about him too. They're interested in him, they realize that in some sense he is one of theirs. It's high time for a conclusion, so that there will be time for some discussion. I've said that a philosopher probably should stand somewhere between literature, poetry on the one hand, and science on the other. And I think if one wants to criticize Nietzsche, one may well say that although this makes him readable and appealing and interesting, he stands a little too far in the direction of out-and-out literature, that there is too little in him of careful summing up, of taking together the different things he has said and himself comparing them instead of just leaving it to somebody else to do this, and seeing what stands up, what doesn't stand up, what has to be qualified. There is too little of that. There are many other criticisms that one can make of Nietzsche, just as in the case of Kierkegaard and of Sartre next week. I don't want to press all of these. One might just pick out one so that you see in what direction I might proceed. I think that occasionally he makes much too sharp a dichotomy between the higher man, the superior person, and the rest of mankind. But one would also have to say that if you read him thoroughly, you find him in other places trying to balance this. The whole 4th part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, for instance, makes fun of the higher man and makes the point quite literally that the higher men stink. I want to end on a positive note, and I will say in conclusion that for all his faults, I think there are exceedingly few philosophers or writers who equal Nietzsche in a fusion of 3 things: of scope, of which he has far more than almost any other philosopher. There's scarcely anything that might interest you intensely that he doesn't deal with. This in itself is no accomplishment. It might all be superficial for all that. So we have to take with us the second point he fuses with it, depth. Whatever he deals with, I think he goes, if not to the bottom of it, he goes very deep. He is very profound. He makes us see things we didn't see before. And then together with the scope and depth, which for all that might be tedious, might be a bore, except for people with a very strong intellectual stomach, he has also a great deal of passion, which makes him contagious, which is a good thing, which makes him inspire other people to be interested and to care strongly. And if you take him all in all, I do think, on reflection, the more I think about him, that he was one of the greatest philosophers and writers of all time. There are very few other philosophers that one can come back to again and again and read for pleasure. First of all, I want to say something about the modern crisis, then something about existentialism and the modern crisis, and then something about Sartre and the crisis in morality. Finally, there will be a conclusion. Now, to begin with the modern crisis, I have examined a crisis in religion and philosophy, about which I want to be very brief at this time, and I still have to examine what I take to be a crisis in morality. And in all three instances, there is one common factor which consists in the enormous rise of the natural sciences and in their wake of the social sciences too. I do believe that this great development of the sciences has an enormous amount to do with what I have called the modern crisis. This does not mean to anticipate that I think that this development of the sciences is regrettable. That doesn't follow at all. I just see a connection there. Now, the way that I conceive of the modern crisis in religion, as many of you by now know, is that science has threatened traditional, naive beliefs, that science has made it impossible for large masses of thoughtful, educated, intelligent people to hold the same kind of beliefs in the same way in which their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and generations for hundreds of years have held them, and has led to a widespread abandonment of these beliefs or to an attempt at reinterpretation. And in the wake of this reinterpretation, there is the very serious question in many instances, what meaning remains to these beliefs? I have further tried to point out in the first lecture that morally, this ties in with tonight's problem, that morally there has come to be a very open, a frequently, frankly avowed process of selection where people admit that they don't accept all the moral commandments of their religion, but that they pick out some while rejecting others as, of course, primitive or, of course, to be accounted for in historical terms or perhaps in psychological terms. And in the wake of this selection, the question arises whether then the morality isn't really based on reason, on experience, on conscience, and whether bringing in religion or God afterwards as a sanction is not merely redundant. There's the further problem I have suggested in the first lecture, that organized religion has always posed for true religion, a point that Kierkegaard made at particular length and with great emphasis, but a point that one could easily trace back through the history of religion at the very least as far as the biblical prophets. And there's also an inverse proportion of the quantity of believers and the quality of believers, a point again abundantly made in the Hebrew scriptures, that in times in which everybody flocks to the temple, religion is likely to become something shallow and superficial, while it is perhaps only the remnant, perhaps only the small number that has religion in a deeper sense. The crisis in philosophy, I have suggested last week, consists in the fact that emulation of the natural sciences leads more and more and more English-speaking philosophers to reject almost all, not quite all, but almost all of traditional philosophy. One begins to wonder whether traditional philosophic tenets are not perhaps just as untenable as traditional religious beliefs. Some of them seem to have to be accounted for, again, either in psychological or more often in historical terms as belonging to a certain era, but many of them no longer seem at all acceptable. This, I think, is a crisis, even if some people would call it by another name. The large body of philosophy that has come down to us has suddenly become questionable. People wonder whether what has been called philosophy hitherto is worth preserving. And what some of them are now doing is something quite different from what was done traditionally, and as far as English-speaking philosophers are concerned, tends on the whole to be very academic and to be of relatively little interest to the very large number, to the steadily growing number of intelligent and concerned laymen in the sense that they are not professional philosophers. There's further the factor that in philosophy, too, organization plays some part, that more and more philosophers find themselves allied with universities. In fact, practically all of them. There are hardly any philosophers left who do not have some university position, and being in the academies, they tend to be more academic. There's a rising number of philosophic journals which are read by fellow craftsmen, so one tends to write for each other, for other professional philosophers, for fellow technicians, instead of dealing with cosmic questions, with religious questions, with the larger moral questions. You might say, even so, where is the crisis? And perhaps I have to add only one thing at this particular point, and that is what creates such a crisis here is that for all the emulation of the sciences, so far, except possibly in such narrow fields as probability theory or something of that sort, certainly philosophers, for all their academic manners, haven't come up with any results comparable to those of the natural sciences. And where is the crisis in morality? The crisis in morality, I think, parallels the crises that I have tried to analyze in religion and in philosophy. Here, too, it is very largely due to the development of science. And again, I'm not at all critical of science for this. I don't hold it against science. On the contrary, I heartily appreciate the, on the whole, anti-authoritarian attitudes that science breeds. In science, there are no authorities. In science, you can always be challenged for the evidence. You can't just say a great man said. You can't cite Newton as an authority. You have to see whether things stand up. Moreover, you have to consider alternative hypotheses. Sometimes there is a seemingly very good hypothesis, but you still have to ask, aren't there some other hypotheses that are just as good? And perhaps one of these alternatives is even more elegant than the one you already have. In this way, traditional morality is undermined. Once one gets into the habit of asking, what's the evidence for what is being said, and aren't there any alternatives, you have an attitude that no longer acquiesces in traditional morality. Traditional morality need not even be exactly the same for everybody. It may differ slightly in some respects, depending on ethnic or on religious background. But what moralities in general have in common, traditional moralities, is that they have something authoritarian to them, that they are originally taught to a child as what's what. The parent knows, the teacher knows, the rabbi, priest, or minister knows, and the child is supposed to accept what it is told. And when one gets into the mood of saying, well, what's the evidence for this, and aren't there perhaps alternatives, traditional morality is undermined. And the obvious result that this has led to can be summed up in one word, namely relativism, moral relativism, where people ask whether whatever morality they have been brought up on isn't possibly just one morality among a large number of moralities, and is there really any reason, they ask, for preferring one to the others. The social sciences have developed further, and again they have had a very critical influence on morality. Here perhaps the best single example would be the kind of thing that is exemplified by the Kinsey reports, by gathering statistics, by telling people what percentage of the population does certain things. People's conscience becomes a little less stern. They have the feeling that there is some safety, at any rate in numbers, that if so many people do such things, they can't be quite so bad. Of course, it would be foolish to suppose that science is the only factor in this crisis in morality. It obviously isn't. There are other factors. For instance, that there are such growing numbers of people, more people than ever before. Well, with a growing number of people, there's also a growing anonymity. There's a loosening of social bonds. There's mobility. More people move around. They move from the country to a city, from a small city to a very big city, from one big city to another city. And as a result of this, there is a loosening of social bonds. Nobody knows you. The neighbors no longer know you. And here, too, certain restrictions fall by the way. And there is necessarily, as a result of this, as there always, I think, has been in history, under comparable circumstances, a growing permissiveness. And all this that I have said so far, I don't mean to take sides. I don't mean to make any particular evaluation. I just want to explain what I mean by the crisis in morality. Perhaps it is relevant and even crucially important to say something about the word crisis at this point. After all, a crisis is not necessarily anything bad anyway. What crisis means, literally, is a turning point, a crucial time. The Greek word krinein means to separate, and you might say that a crisis is the time which separates the men from the boys. It is somehow a decisive moment. Krinein means not only separate but also decide. Crisis is the moment of decision, or to use a term that is used in a certain sport, it's the moment of truth. The moment when you sort of see what stands up and what doesn't stand up. It's in that spirit that I speak of crisis, not in a nostalgic way, not by way of suggesting, aren't we an unfortunate generation, that ours is a time of crisis, but I want to leave wide open whether every time isn't possibly a time of crisis, and whether if, in some respects, our crises are more acute than ever, I want to leave open whether that is a good or a bad thing. Now, one trouble with these lectures, I think, has been that in the last lecture, although I did speak of Nietzsche, I did not, on the whole, concentrate on existentialism, but I illustrated the crisis in philosophy very largely from English-speaking philosophy. And so I, after having, in these general terms, characterized the modern crisis, want next to deal with existentialism and the modern crisis. And here, at least in the beginning, I can again fall back on some points previously made. I'll first deal very briefly with the two men to whom I have already devoted a lecture apiece, namely Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. One thing that they have in common, in spite of the many things that very obviously they don't have in common, is that both of them were aware of the kind of crisis that I have tried to picture for you. I don't at all go along with the attempt made by some people of kind of throwing Kierkegaard and Nietzsche together as if all their many differences were unimportant. It does seem to me that very obviously the differences are in reality more important than the things that they have in common. They're more important because they differed on the things that mattered most to them. Nothing mattered more to Kierkegaard than how one might become a true Christian, and probably few things mattered more to Nietzsche than his criticism of Christianity, not just of Christendom, but of Christianity. But for all that, they do have some things in common, and one thing they have in common is that in the middle of the 19th century, or one man in the middle and one man a little later, still in the 19th century, they foresaw a crisis that many people even today are not fully aware of. And one thing further that both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche recognized, and this was no mean feat in their time, was that this crisis was intimately related to the progress of science. They both recognized that. Kierkegaard drew the conclusion from this, and I dealt in detail with this in the first lecture, that science was a bad thing, that science was a dangerous thing, and that one ought to have the courage to be unscientific, that one ought to have the courage to believe what science considers absurd, that one ought to go against reason and against science. Nietzsche's attitude, on the whole, I think, was in favor of science. This is one of the points on which I have tried in my work on Nietzsche to interpret him somewhat differently from the way many other people have interpreted him. I've tried to show in considerable detail that his attitude toward reason was on the whole affirmative, appreciative, and similarly also his attitude toward science. And there are abundant texts to bear this out, and in his criticism of Christianity, he comes back to this theme time and again, that Christianity has been anti-scientific, anti-rational. But although Nietzsche, in important respects, made common cause with science, he did not share, as most of the thinkers of the later 19th century did, the vast optimism about science, as if now that we have science and science grows, it will solve all our problems and people will become more humane and better and everything will be fine. Nietzsche, while affirming science, realized that science did produce crises in religion, in philosophy, and in morality. Moreover, he did not agree with the English-speaking philosophers today who want to make of philosophy an academic specialty modeled on the sciences. Nietzsche did not believe in restricting philosophy to matters on which factual agreement can be obtained. In these respects, he was not at all in favor of emulating science. Here he saw some of the dangers of science. What he was in favor of, and this is a distinction worth making, and a distinction with which I definitely ally myself, what he was in favor of was careful, critical thinking, and even experimental thinking to the extent of being willing to engage in thought experiments, to consider alternative views in morality, in theory of knowledge, wherever philosophers think, to weigh these against each other. There's actually one of Nietzsche's books that has the title Fröhliche Wissenschaft and subtitled Gaia Scienza, and in English should be called The Gay Science, although unfortunately it was translated, very misleadingly I think, as The Joyful Wisdom. What Nietzsche had in mind was gay science, and what he meant by science was this open-minded, critical, experimental spirit. So both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche understood the crisis, understood its connection with science, but took different views of science. Now, briefly, before I turn to Sartre, I want to go on from Kierkegaard and Nietzsche to a couple of existentialists whom I do not propose to discuss in any detail, but of whom at least I want to indicate briefly, as was suggested in the printed announcement of these lectures, how they fit into the picture, at least how I propose to fit them into this picture. There is, first of all, Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher still living, now in his 70s, who is by some people considered the most profound existentialist philosopher. Now, how Heidegger reacts to the modern crisis can be, I think, not unfairly suggested by a sentence that I shall quote from him, and that incidentally is also quoted emphatically and apparently with approval in a recent very popular book on existentialism, where it is also singled out as very characteristic, although the author finds no fault with it. So it's not malice that dictates my picking this particular sentence. The sentence is, "Thinking does not begin until we learn that reason, though glorified for centuries, is the most stubborn adversary of thinking." This is what Heidegger says. Thinking does not begin until we learn that reason, though glorified for centuries, is the most stubborn adversary of thinking. I think this is very interesting. In this respect, Heidegger, although widely characterized as an atheist, and he doesn't mind this characterization, he certainly is not a theist. I don't like these labels of theist and atheist particularly, but he is certainly avowedly not a theist. In this respect, Heidegger is much closer to Kierkegaard than are such people as, for example, Karl Jaspers and Paul Tillich, who make much more of their respect and admiration for Kierkegaard than Heidegger does. When Heidegger talks of Kierkegaard these days, it's by way of depreciation. He was not a philosopher, he was merely a religious thinker. Leaving out the merely, I agree that Kierkegaard was no philosopher, but a religious writer. He said so himself. But in this anti-scientific, anti-rational bias, this is interesting, I think, Heidegger, though not a Christian and not a theist, is really much closer to Kierkegaard than any number of other contemporary existentialists. Now, what remains if you have this animus against reason, if you recognize, as Heidegger too does, the connection between science and technology and the characteristic feats of the 20th century, if you recognize the connection between that, what is usually considered progress on the one hand, and the crisis in religion, philosophy, and morality on the other hand. Well, he draws the conclusion we must therefore, in some sense, oppose scientific thinking. We must oppose reason. This raises the big question, well, how then is one as a philosopher going to think and write? And what I think almost necessarily has to happen is that a philosopher who adopts this attitude must relapse into a highly arbitrary way of thinking, which will either be associative thinking, just sort of moving from one sentiment to the next one that's associated, almost the way a Freudian patient on the couch does when engaging in free association, or doing something else which really isn't so different, namely, in order to avoid total anarchy and incoherence, to find some texts of which he can then offer exegeses. And in this way, Heidegger seeks his way back to the earliest philosophers, the pre-Socratic philosophers, some of whom wrote poetically, some of whom wrote aphoristically, and all of whom have one thing in common, and that is that we don't possess any of their works, but only scattered quotations, only fragments preserved in the writings of other people. I share with Heidegger an enormously high regard for some of these fragments, which are fascinating, which are worth studying. But I don't think it is an example of sound method to try to develop a philosophy by taking sentences out of context. Usually there is no context. When there is one, Heidegger still takes them out of context, and then, and this is almost inevitable, reading his own ideas into them. This is not just my opinion, but even those followers of Heidegger who greatly admire his earlier work, if they happen to be classical philologists as well, roundly repudiate his interpretations of Greek philosophers as philologically untenable. And people who know their Rilke realize that his Rilke interpretations are untenable, and people who know their Nietzsche realize that his Nietzsche interpretations are untenable. But this is not surprising. This is not just something that happens to happen, but if thinking does not begin until we learn that reason, though glorified for centuries, is the most stubborn adversary of thinking, if we deliberately overrule reason and scientific procedures in the sense of a regard for evidence and impartiality, well then, how can the interpretations be sound? They might in places be enormously suggestive and exciting, but I never can persuade myself that it's very difficult to be suggestive and exciting if one doesn't care to be sound. I'll give you one example, which is both in print and which I also happen to hear in person. Heidegger gave a series of lectures at Freiburg in 1955-56 on what he called der Satz vom Grund, which seemed to mean the principle of reason, the principle of sufficient reason. And the turning point of the lectures was provided by a sentence which I will initially have to give in German, and I trust that some of you will understand it. He began to talk about the leap, one of Kierkegaard's conceptions, L-E-A-P, the jump, the leap. And he said, der Sprung ist der Satz vom Grundsatz vom Grund in das Sagen des Seins. Which means something like, the leap is the jump from the basic principle of reason into saying something about being. But it all depends on punning. Namely, the word Satz, he suddenly pointed out, doesn't only mean sentence or principle, but can also mean in German jump or leap, as when one says, Heidegger's own example, ist mit einem Satz zur Tür hinaus, he is out of the door with one jump. And similarly, Grund can also mean ground, so that suddenly from the principle of reason, we get to the jump from the ground. Now, this is the height of arbitrariness. It is suggestive, but it is terribly close, and for a philosopher, compromisingly close to Finnegan's Wake. This makes it eminently suitable for study in graduate seminars, where you want to discuss something that's difficult and puzzle it out, and something can perhaps be learned from it. But the important thing is that not only is the whole history of philosophy since the pre-Socratics rejected by Heidegger because it attempts to be rational and reasonable, but what we get instead is something that is in its nature completely arbitrary, unsound, and dangerous. That he might, for all that, have occasional insights is another matter. I personally happen to think that he has fewer of those than other existentialists. This may be a minority view, and I shall not try to argue it in detail here. I have dealt, I might say, with Heidegger in some detail, and for that matter also with Jaspers in some detail, in From Shakespeare to Existentialism, which was recently issued in paperback by Anchor Books, in chapters 15, 17, and 18. And there, too, is a chapter, it happens to be chapter 14, that deals in some detail with the relation of philosophy and poetry, which of course is crucial for doing justice to Heidegger, since what he wants to do is bring philosophy closer to poetry than to science. So I'll refer you here to my From Shakespeare to Existentialism and move on to a few passing remarks about Jaspers and Tillich before moving on to Sartre, with whom I want to deal in some detail. In Jaspers and also in Tillich, who are in many ways, I think, similar, you find attitudes that are avowedly and emphatically in favor of reason and in favor of science. They both, on the whole, lean over backwards not to share Kierkegaard's anti-scientific bias, but rather to welcome science. Where religion and science conflict, Tillich is likely to say that religion must be in the wrong, and similarly, Jaspers insists, being himself a doctor of medicine who specialized later in psychiatry, that it is good training for a philosopher to master one of the sciences. It's interesting, as I have already mentioned, that both of them make so much more of Kierkegaard than Heidegger, that both of them are closer to Kierkegaard's religion, though I think very far indeed from sharing it, than Heidegger, but that nevertheless, in spite of that, in basic orientation, they really have terribly little in common with Kierkegaard. And I might say that although both of them are clearly more attractive personalities than Heidegger, that both of them clearly have a kind of personal integrity that many of us feel Heidegger, if he had it, ever lost during the Nazi period, that for all that perhaps both Jaspers and Tillich are less radical, for better or for worse, than Kierkegaard, and then Nietzsche, and then Heidegger, and then Sartre. They see some of the elements of the modern crisis. I am not sure that they go quite so much to the roots of it as I think Sartre does. And now, by way of making a transition to Sartre, I might say that here again I think I'm submitting to you a minority view. I think it is on the whole fashionable to say that Heidegger, particularly if one hasn't read him, is surely the profound Teutonic thinker, while Sartre is merely the journalist who popularizes all this. I don't agree with this at all. I esteem Sartre not only as a human being, but also quite emphatically as a writer and thinker, much more highly than I do Heidegger, and higher also than Jaspers, and so I have selected him for more detailed treatment, partly out of regard for him. I'm now ready, finally, to deal with Sartre and the crisis in morality. Very briefly, first of all, a very few data about the man. He was born in Paris in 1905 and suffered the same fate that Nietzsche suffered in one respect. He lost his father as a little boy. His father died, and then he was brought up by his mother in the maternal grandparents' house. And there's something interesting about this. His maternal grandfather is an Alsatian, or was an Alsatian, by the name of Schweitzer, and Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Schweitzer are cousins, which I suppose few of you knew, and which I think is a rather piquant little detail. His mother remarried when little Jean-Paul Sartre was 11 and moved with a boy from the Alsace to La Rochelle, where he grew up. Then he absolved his military service, studied philosophy as a philosopher, as Heidegger had done earlier. He studied for a while with Edmund Husserl, the German Jewish founder of the School of Phenomenology, was very profoundly impressed by Husserl, and started out as a philosopher with a phenomenological orientation. He did some teaching before the war, and on the eve of the First World War in 1938 published his first novel, available in paperback, Nausea, followed it up the following year in 1939 with a collection of short stories, originally named in French Le Mur and in English The Wall, but then when it got to the paperback level, it was called Intimacy, and had a variety of rather lurid covers. But seeing that there are 5 short stories, one of which is called The Wall and one of which is called Intimacy, I must say that having read the 5, I think Intimacy is the more accurate title. In this case, it does not promise too much. I don't think that the stories are in any sense pornographic. I don't know that it is not misleading when the cover quotes a British magazine that said, "Leaves Lady Chatterley sleeping at the doorpost." But they are very frank and forthright stories which I think have points to make, and which I happen to think, again a minority view perhaps, are very excellent and very profound and very interesting stories. He also published, before the war broke out, several philosophic essays, mainly phenomenological. Then he published what might be, without hesitation, called his main works during the war, chiefly L'Être et le Néant, Being and Nothingness, translated in full into English by Hazel Barnes, and available in one big volume and very difficult to read in large parts, as well as a play that came out the same year, The Flies, Les Mouches, and about the same time another play, No Exit, and then any number of further plays, of which perhaps the single most interesting is the one Le Diable et le Bon Dieu, Lucifer and the Lord, or The Devil and the Good Lord. Also published quite a bit of literary criticism. In 1946, a lecture to which I shall have to recur when I start in a moment talking about morality, which is called Existentialism is a Humanism. And then what is probably his most controversial work, a long book on a man who was, at the time that this book was written, simply considered vile and a criminal, but who is now widely considered party without ever belonging to it. He felt that if one was seriously against the status quo, that then one ought to make common cause with the one party, so it seemed to him, that was serious about overthrowing existing society and changing it. He never seems to have been under any illusions that surely his own head would have been one of the first to roll if the communists should have taken over. I think he did show on this rather abominable bad judgment. I think that there was a certain obtuseness about it, but it is interesting that he never followed any strict party line, but remained, as one would expect of him, all along an eccentric individualist. After Budapest, he welcomed, I think, the opportunity of having some cause now over which he could openly dissociate himself from the Communist Party. He did it in an interview that was published in English in, I think, the first issue of the Evergreen Review. It's very interesting to read. I think it's, to my mind, a somewhat dismal performance, which, again, although he now is anti-communist, does not, to my mind, show any political penetration or particular good sense. I don't think that this is the most serious matter that one can say about a philosopher. I would cheerfully say that Plato did not have much political good sense either, and it remains an open question whether a philosopher who is politically not very perceptive might not possibly be very profound in other matters. Now, what is the core of Sartre's philosophy? At that point, clearly, one has to make a selection, and people will differ about what is the core. I will suggest that perhaps the central idea of Sartre's philosophy is, and I will here, so far as possible, paraphrase him, that man is, in Sartre's fine phrase, condemned to be free. Man is condemned to be free. And the meaning of this comes out in Sartre's addition that man is constantly tempted to hide his freedom from himself and to live in bad faith. Call it bad faith, or call it, as I have done in my little anthology of existentialism from Dostoevsky to Sartre, in which the wall is reprinted along with the lecture on existentialism is a humanism, and Portrait of the Anti-Semite, the section also on bad faith from L'Être et le Néant, and I don't call it bad faith, I call it self-deception. It's no great matter. It means, I think, much the same thing. Sartre's point is that man tries to deceive himself about his own freedom. He tries to deceive himself into thinking that he is not as free as in fact he is, perhaps even into thinking that he is not at all free. What man craves, Sartre thinks, is a different mode of being altogether from the human mode of being. Sartre suggests that there are two modes of being, the ones that he calls, using phrases out of Hegel, out of the German philosopher Hegel, en soi and pour soi, the in itself and the for itself. But we don't need this particular terminology. We can say the two kinds of being are the en soi, the being of things, and the pour soi, the human mode of being. And things, Sartre suggests, have a mode of being that is characterized, or so at least it seems to man, by a solidity that men do not have. In this connection, I personally think that Sartre engages in altogether too much jargon, in unnecessary verbiage, which is modeled after Hegel and after Heidegger, sometimes also after Husserl, that's exceedingly academic, in the worst tradition of academic philosophy, and that in places can, I think, hardly be construed and figured out. But for all that, I'm very far from saying that that's all there's to it. On the contrary, my whole point is that in this forbidding shell, there are what I consider some very profound insights. What man, Sartre thinks, wants is the solidity that characterizes the being of things. Man wants to exist all at once. He wants to be there all at once, like a rock, like a piece of stone that's impermeable. He wants to have that kind of an identity. And when you have a quiet moment, when you are, say, by yourself, and suddenly realize that you could also be quite different from the way you are. Let's say you happen to be giving a lecture, or you happen to be a professor, or you happen to be a doctor or a lawyer or a businessman or what have you, that you really aren't a doctor, lawyer, businessman, a professor, or giving a lecture in the same way in which a stone is hard or in which water contains oxygen, but that it's up to you, up to a decision that you make, whether you remain that way. I could right now stop this lecture and walk out. I could right now resign my job. You could become quite different. You could give up the kind of career that you have had so far. You could suddenly decide that you will take the first ship on which you can get and go to Africa to do something or other, to work with Schweitzer, to make trouble in the Congo, any number of things. There are all these possibilities. Now one can dress up some of these possibilities in a humorous way and just be entertaining about it. But when it strikes home, when you suddenly realize that there is something of a fake security about your present mode of life, that it could suddenly be changed altogether, that's rather frightening. It's much more comforting to think, as for me, I am such and such a person. As for me, I happen to be a lawyer. Well, that's me. Or as for me, for that matter, I happen to be an anti-Semite, and there you are, and now make of that what you want to. Now, isn't that frightening? This is the kind of person I am. Now, while we don't necessarily adopt such aggressive views as Sartre's anti-Semite does, and as anti-Semites generally do, Sartre, I think, is suggesting that the anti-Semite that he sketches for us is merely characteristic of a common human tendency, that the way that the anti-Semite lives in bad faith is only an extreme example of a way in which most of us decline the full and frightening measure of their responsibility and somehow seek security in a spurious sort of solidity. I think that there are few, if any, people in the whole of literature and philosophy who have explored in such detail and with such a wealth of ingenuity and insight the mechanisms of self-deception, the ways in which people fool themselves. It is not something altogether new with Sartre, far from it. For example, if you read Anna Karenina by Tolstoy, you may find, to your surprise perhaps, that this is one of the themes that runs all through the book. To the best of my knowledge, it's not a point that has been widely noted or that has been made in print, but I think it is one of Tolstoy's central preoccupations too, to point out how people deceive themselves. It's interesting how often the word self-deception and deceived himself and did not want to know, phrases like that, how often they occur in Anna Karenina. So I'm not trying to say this is something altogether novel in Sartre. Obviously it isn't. But I think that if you consider that some other people tried their hand before it, and some very formidable and wonderful people like Tolstoy, it's doubly remarkable that Sartre should have come up with so much that is so good on this subject. And now by way of leading into morality from there, there's of course one person who explored self-deception a little earlier than Sartre, and that is Sigmund Freud. And Sartre devotes a section of his main work, Being and Nothingness, to what he calls existential psychoanalysis. He isn't, I think, in that quite as emphatic as he might be about making clear that Freud has some priority here, that Freud developed psychoanalysis, and that now Jean-Paul Sartre is trying to introduce some variations. At times it almost sounds as if it were a well-known fact that, of course, there are two kinds of psychoanalysis, Freudian and Sartrean. But there is one important difference which I think much less separates Sartre from Freud than it separates Sartre from many followers of Freud, and not only from followers of Freud, but quite especially from the large lay following that Freud enjoys, the people who have read some Freud and use him. How? Well, precisely to do what Sartre is most preoccupied with attacking, namely to deceive themselves about their freedom, to live in bad faith, to hide from themselves their freedom. I don't think that this amounts to a very fatal attack on Sigmund Freud himself. It's not a point that in this lecture I want to go into deeply. But I think that Sartre is clearly right that many people who have read Freud tend to say, as if it were obvious, well, this is the way I am, and of course it's all the fault of my governor, so all the fault of my father or my mother, the way I was brought up, and something happened to me when I was 2, and that accounts for the way I am. So this is a way, according to Sartre, of self-deception, of living in bad faith, of hiding your freedom from yourself. Here, Freud himself, who went out to attack self-deception, has been quickly made into another instrument and tool of self-deception. Now, what I've been saying amounts in a way to suggesting, and this on purpose, that Sartre's central inspiration is moral, that Sartre's central concern is in a way that of a moralist. For all that, it is a fact that his major work ends with a promise that he will, before long, give us an ethic, and he has not so far been able to give us an ethic that satisfies himself. He has not worked out a book on ethics. But for all that, I think in all of his work, deeply moral concerns are implicit. And so I shall now suggest what I think are Sartre's major insights about morality. Number one, he clearly denies that there is any absolute morality. He clearly denies that there are any moral facts, facts that are simply there for us to recognize and to conform to. Another way of putting this is to say that his view of morality is anti-Platonic. Plato, in an important sense, believed, even if Socrates before him didn't, Plato believed that there were forms, ideas beyond this world of justice and temperance and courage and other virtues, also a form of the good, and that it was up to us to see these forms, to have a vision of them, and if we couldn't, and most of us can't, then to listen to people who have had such a vision. In other words, according to Plato, there are, as it were, moral facts which man should realize and then conform to in his life. Many religious people look at it similarly, that there are certain things that as a matter of fact are good and evil, and that man should recognize these and live accordingly. Sartre, on the other hand, denies absolute morality and suggests that morality is a matter of choice, not just a matter of choosing whether I want to be a good boy or a bad boy, but a matter of choosing moral codes, of choosing what I am to consider moral and immoral. I don't know whether this so far would strike, let us say, the majority of this particular audience as particularly radical. Very likely not. Very likely, so far, a very large percentage of modern intellectuals would not only go along, but even say, well, surely that's a commonplace. But Sartre goes further. He suggests further that there is no human nature. He says there is no human nature. Now, what does this mean? There are some people, notably including some of Freud's most famous followers who are critical of him, who have tried to develop a more or less absolute ethic, a humanistic ethic, by way of suggesting that there is a human nature, and that once you recognize what this human nature is, it becomes obvious that some things are good for it and other things are bad for it. You only have to be a doctor, that is the suggestion here, to realize that some things will ruin the patient and others will make him function properly. And this means that after all, everything isn't so bad, everything isn't so serious, everything isn't so critical. There are certain things that are good for all men, and there are other things that are bad for all men. This is a very comforting view, and I dare say an extremely popular view. And very large numbers of educated intellectual people who agree that in the old Platonic or religious sense there are no absolute values, assume that in this sense you can somehow reinstate a universal and, up to a point, absolute morality. Sartre does not agree with this. He thinks that there's no human nature for which some things are good and some bad, but that, and I quote him again, man makes himself. That man decides what is good for him and what is bad for him, and that man has to choose here. And that if he kids himself into thinking that there are certain things that just plain are good for people, or that just plain are bad for people, Sartre would say he engages once again in his favorite game of self-deception. He once again lives in bad faith. Now, it may of course be suggested, and is often suggested by the people who use the strategy that I have just outlined, that not only are there things that are good for all men and that are bad for all men, but that of course this isn't new at all, but that all the great religious teachers of mankind agree, that they have all taught the same things, that there is a significant moral agreement, and that in this way the latest science and the oldest religions agree. Is this view right, which is so popular, or is it possible that Sartre is more profound at this point? I would side with Sartre on this. I do not agree that human nature being what it is, certain kinds of behavior are bound to be disastrous and to bring unhappiness, let's say, for example, murder, theft, polygamy, dishonesty, while on the other hand, altruism, monogamy, and honesty are the best policy. I don't agree with that in quite that way. And of course, this last way of putting it sounds cynical. Well, the people who put forward this view bend over backwards not to be cynical. They avoid all cynicism, and they appeal not only to anthropology, sociology, above all psychology, but they also make frequent and respectful bows to mankind's greatest moral teachers. And just as there is a ready-made audience for archaeologists who claim to prove that the Bible was right, there's also a ready-made audience for social scientists who prove the great religious teachers right. If one engages in that sort of thing, one can hardly fail, at least as far as popularity goes. But there are a number of things that are wrong with it. The first one is that the great religious teachers of mankind did not agree about morality. I won't go into any very great detail about that in this lecture. There will be opportunity if some of you want to challenge me about this in the discussion to engage further in argument about this. I'll just point out that even the people who claim that the great religious teachers of mankind agree are forced very soon to say that, of course, some of the so-called great religious teachers were not really great, that some of them were very bad. We somehow have to separate out here the good religious teachers and the bad religious teachers, at which point this particular appeal, so far as I can see, breaks down completely. In that case, we might say some religious teachers agree, but others don't agree, and if the only way we have of finding out which ones are right is not by looking to them, but by examining the facts, then the appeal to authority crumbles. But when that does crumble, then I think the second fault of this strategy, which alone is crucial, meets the eye. And that is that science can present facts, but it does not establish any standards. It might conceivably show us what makes people happy and what does not. It might tell us what conditions favor a great burst of poetic creativity and what don't. What conditions make for excellence in sculpture, for great architecture, and what conditions don't. What conditions make for impressive music and what conditions don't. Always assuming here, of course, that we can agree on what is great music, great architecture, great sculpture, and so forth, which is a moot point. One might also possibly expect that scientists can tell us what social arrangements or what kind of behavior has promoted major scientific breakthroughs. But what science cannot tell us is what goals we should choose, whether we should choose happiness or scientific breakthroughs or excellence in sculpture or in poetry or in music. Now, what of course is immensely popular is to tell people that they can have everything and heaven too. There's no need to make any choices at all. A maximum of pleasure and of science and of art and of philosophy and of music, of morality, of comfort, of high standard of living, of religion, liberty, poetry, can all be had if we will only learn the art of loving. Or to put... There's a biblical formulation of it: seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Or in modernese, become mature, and all these things shall be yours as well. But to my mind, this is really a view that is the quintessence of immaturity, besides being thoroughly unscientific. One sees here the world in black and white. On the one side, there's Jesus, justice, joy, love, truth, Freud, and all the good guys. And on the other side, you get guile, gloom, guilt, tyrants, totalitarians. And then, in this extremely simple-minded scheme, no serious decisions have to be made anymore. It's obvious. Who is going to choose the side that has such guys as Hitler and Stalin in there? Nobody wants that, and it's suggested that all the others are on the goody gumdrop side, so we don't have to make any choices. But this isn't so. This is so for people who don't want to grow up. that they have the idea that one doesn't have to make choices, that everything is simple. It looks as if moral conduct had here been reduced simply to psychological maturity, that we don't have to grow up and face the frightening complexities of life. We are saved from all serious choices, serious quandaries, from dread responsibility. There's no need anymore for tragedy. We can have all good things without missing anything worth having. But I think Sartre, with his much more tragic view, is much more nearly right here. Take a very simple issue that should be much on our minds these days. The people who say our survival is at stake and may hinge on agreement on some absolute morality. Now, what then is the standard? Should it be survival at any price? Would it be better for humanity to endure for a few more thousand years under a Hitler, or in Huxley's Brave New World, or in some ant-like state with drastically reduced potential, or on the other hand, let us say, to have a final great flowering of culture far exceeding anything yet known, and then to perish nobly? I don't want to say that this is a black and white choice. It's a difficult choice, and one has to discuss it and consider it. And I think each of us must decide after painstaking reflection and discussion what he is to value ultimately. Some people say monogamy is clearly right because there are approximately equal numbers of men and women, and so it follows that this is the best arrangement. But in Germany, for example, at the end of World War II, there were ever so many more women than men. Should we then conclude that, of course, in that situation it's all right for one man to have many wives, and in other countries for one woman to have many husbands, while in most countries monogamy should be the rule? Or might we not have to face the possibility, which Plato, much more radical, did face, that perhaps the whole institution of marriage might be a bad thing, and perhaps under certain circumstances ought to be abolished? What I'm trying to do here is not solve these problems at all for you, but lend some substance to Sartre's suggestion that we do ultimately in morality have to make choices, and that we can't turn to some daddy figure who will tell us, I have studied religion, or I have studied science, or psychology, or medicine, or what have you, and I'll tell you what's good for you. No appeal to science, no appeal to expediency can settle the central moral questions which concern ultimate standards. Because what is expedient, what is good in this instrumental sense, always depends on what your goal is. And while science may tell us how various goals can or cannot be reached, it does not tell us what goals to seek. Now, the enormous question that a man like Sartre faces, after having said something of this sort, and of course much of the detail here was mine rather than his, by way of lending substance to what I take it is his view, the enormous problem that he faces is whether he is not now confronted with moral anarchy. How can he, if he says there is no such human nature, we have to choose our standards, how can he then avoid complete moral anarchy? And I think he has not found the answer to this question, though he has tried. The big question, if you want to put it differently, is how can he distinguish between a responsible choice and an irresponsible choice? Well, this is what he tried to do in his famous lecture on Existentialism is a Humanism, and I think that that attempt in his lecture was clearly a failure. I think it was very ill-considered. What he suggested, and I'll make a very long story very short here, what he suggested distinguished the responsible choice from the irresponsible one. What he thought warranted his rebuttal of any charge of anarchy, what warranted him in saying that there was responsibility possible after all, was that nothing can be better for us unless it's better for all. And this, I think, is very clearly wrong. And I find it quite astonishing that a man as steeped in André Gide and Friedrich Nietzsche as Sartre is, should have said that nothing can be better for us unless it's better for all, seeing that as I read André Gide's novels and as I read Nietzsche's philosophy, this is their bête noire. This is the thing that they were fighting against all the time, this idea that nothing can be better for us unless it's better for all. Now what Sartre wants to do is in this way introduce responsibility. And how it doesn't work comes out beautifully in his own example. If he says, I decide to marry and to have children, even though this decision proceeds simply from my situation, from my passion or my desire, I am thereby committing not only myself, but humanity as a whole to the practice of monogamy. I am thus responsible for myself and for all men, and I am creating a certain image of man as I would have him to be. In fashioning myself, I fashion man. That in a lecture, I think, is fine rhetoric, and it's a noble conclusion, but it doesn't stand up. If I marry one wife, I'm not necessarily implying that monogamy is better for all. It's not at all irrational or irresponsible to suggest that I propose to make a go of it with this one wife without having any wish whatever to limit other people who have more money or who are sexually different inclined or who find themselves in quite a different situation or environment from behaving quite differently, not marrying at all or having more than one wife. Similarly, if I choose to have 2 children, I needn't object to other couples having either no children at all, or 1, or 3, or more. When we consider choosing a profession or writing a book, the point is even more obvious, surely. When I elect to become a philosopher, I don't imply that such a career is better for all. It's quite conceivable, although I'm not trying to make any great confession now, it's conceivable that I would prefer being a great composer, or that I would prefer being a Michelangelo, but that I find that I haven't got what it takes. Now that wouldn't mean that if therefore I become a philosopher, that I should feel that other people more fortunate than I should become philosophers too, or the other way around, that others who happen to lack whatever gifts I might have ought to follow my example. Take a still more specific case, which leads it utterly to the absurd, and that is suppose that I decide to write a certain book. Now in that case, surely I don't want everybody to write that book. If I knew that even one other guy was writing that kind of a book, I would want to change mine. So I think that in his attempt to meet the charge of irresponsibility, Sartre has failed. And here I will just take a swipe at somebody else, being very close now to my conclusions, and we can explore that more in the discussion if you want to. I think Camus is another man who has failed at that point. Camus, too, somehow wants people to make responsible choices, thinks there is nothing that is absolutely right for everybody, but I think has been unable to give a criterion for what makes some choices better than others. This comes out very movingly in what many people consider his greatest work, La Peste, The Plague, where the central character, a doctor, takes the attitude that if a man wants to leave the town and turn his back on the rest of mankind and just seek his own happiness, well, no reason can be given why he shouldn't do that, but on the other hand, he wishes that such a man wouldn't blame him for doing what he does. Here you have a resignation in the face of this problem. And with this I come to my conclusion. I think that existentialism has the enormous virtue of recognizing the nature of the modern crisis, which I think other philosophers on the whole have not been doing. And further, existentialists have occasionally diagnosed this crisis exceedingly well, nor have they been defeatist about it. But when it comes to their positive prescriptions, I think it's fair to say that this has been, on the whole, their weakest part. If you turn to somebody like Kierkegaard, he suggests that we should throw reason out the window. When it comes to Sartre trying to reintroduce responsibility, he fails. But too many English-speaking philosophers have been playing ostrich, and it's a good thing to have people who face up to a crisis and diagnose it honestly, even if they don't quite know what to do about it. And here then is another answer to the question which I have tried to answer at the end of the first lecture and at the beginning of the second lecture, and now again at the end of the third, why one should study men with terrible views. Not because of their occasionally terrible prescriptions. Plato, too, offered some perfectly dreadful prescriptions, but rather because they face up to problems and see connections that other people don't see. You might ask in the end whether I think that some of these problems can be solved, and the answer is that I have tried to solve some of these problems, particularly some of the ones that I've been talking about today, in my next book, The Faith of a Heretic, which Doubleday will publish next summer, but I don't think that this is the time for going into my own solution, because my topic is existentialism and the modern crisis.